Chapter 22:11. Xian Suntian's strength was not to be underestimated. He was a peerless genius that had been carefully nurtured by the Tianjian sect. For Xian Suntian, the Tianjian sect had paid a huge price to obtain the upper sword execution order portrait. They had even made an exception and passed down the flying celestial sword art, the supreme technique of the Tianjian sect. Now, even the unparalleled sword ring had been given to Xian Suntian. It was obvious that the Tianjian sect valued Xian Suntian. The Tianjian sect's foundation was unfathomable. It was even related to the rumored Tianjiu domain. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate Xian Suntian. Chu Fengmian hid his body and followed Xian Suntian 100 feet away. Although they were 1,000 feet apart, Chu Fengmian's five senses, every movement of Xian Suntian and their conversation couldn't escape his eyes. Chu Fengmian also followed Xian Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. Chu Fengmian was worried that there would be danger in the valley. Hence, he did not enter rashly. Now that Xian Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the valley, they could help Chu Fengmian explore the dangers in the valley. If there was no danger, Chu Fengmian could take action immediately and snatch the unparalleled sword technique. Given Chu Fengmian's current strength, it would not be a problem to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the two of them. Xian Suntian, Flying Sword Emperor, even if the two of you join forces and plot for half a day, the unparalleled sword technique will still fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. Chu Fengmian's lips curled into a cold smile. However, he had already completely hidden his body in the surrounding space. There was no fluctuation that could be transmitted out. Xian Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor were extremely cautious when they entered the valley. They walked step by step into the valley, not daring to rush in rashly. It was indeed strange that there were no traces of any desolate beasts in the valley. Xian Suntian could sense that the unparalleled sword technique was in the valley with the help of the unparalleled sword ring. However, he did not know what exactly was hidden in the valley. However, Chu Fengmian could sense that there was an invisible force that shrouded the sky above the valley. His spiritual consciousness was suppressed within it. If they were outside, they wouldn't be able to use their spiritual sense to explore the valley. He could only step into it and observe it with his own eyes. Chu Fengmian followed Mysterious Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor all the way to the depths of the valley. The valleys on both sides of the valley became wider and wider until they reached the deepest part. A huge cave appeared before Chu Fengmian's eyes. The cave was thousands of feet long and wide, and could accommodate a huge creature. The unparalleled sword art is in this cave. As they approached the cave, everyone could clearly feel the sword intent that was emitted from the cave. The sword intent was so strong that it actually took the form of numerous spiritual swords when it appeared. Just the sword will that appeared was enough to take form. Only the unparalleled sword art, one of the 10 supreme immortal arts of the antiquity times, could possess such power. Without needing to enter the cave, Chu Fengmian could confirm that the unparalleled sword art was indeed in the cave. Not only Chu Fengmian, but Xian Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor also noticed it immediately. They looked into the cave and saw that it was pitch black. Their faces were filled with fear. In the valley, spiritual consciousness could not be spread out at all. As such, no one knew what was hidden in the cave. After stepping into the immortal general realm, although their five senses were thousands of times better than ordinary people, it was still difficult to see what was hidden in the pitch-black cave. Since we are already here, there is no reason to leave. Moreover, if the Divine Sword Emperor and Chu Fengmian discover this cave, it will be troublesome. Let's go in directly. Xian Suntian's eyes flickered and there was a hint of madness in his eyes. Wealth came from danger. No matter what, he was the first to discover the cave. Naturally, he could not delay until Chu Fengmian and the Divine Sword Emperor arrived. Not only Chu Fengmian, but the Divine Sword Emperor's strength was also unfathomable. Although Xian Suntian's sword principle had surpassed the Divine Sword Emperor in the previous round, it did not represent his true strength. Xian Suntian did not want to delay any longer. If we join forces, we can retreat directly if we encounter any danger. The Flying Sword Emperor nodded. The two of them took out their spiritual swords and walked into the cave together. Looking at Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor walking into the cave, Chu Fengmian also stopped outside the cave and did not enter rashly. However, Chu Fengmian was fully focused on every movement in the cave. No sound could escape his ears. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, time passed by bit. Since Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the cave, there had been no commotion. Although Chu Fengmian's face was as calm as possible, there was still some anxiety in his heart. If there was nothing in the cave and Xian Sungtian obtained the unparalleled sword principle, everything would be over. At that time, the Supreme Sword Sect's inheritance would fall into Xian Sungtian's hands. The first person that Xian Sungtian wanted to kill would be Chu Fengmian. Boom! Just as Chu Fengmian was getting anxious and was about to enter the cave, a sudden roar resounded. Inside the cave, the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Immortal energy exploded within the cave. Waves of aftershocks erupted from the cave. Let's go! Swoosh! In an instant, 2 figures flew out of the cave. These 2 figures were Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor who had just entered the cave. The 2 of them flew out of the cave in horror. At a glance, more than half of their bodies had disappeared without a trace. It was as if more than half of their bodies had been bitten off and they looked extremely miserable. In order to escape from the cave, the 2 of them did not spare any energy to reconstruct their bodies. Obviously, the 2 of them had fallen into an extremely dangerous situation. That was why they had escaped in such a hurry. There's something in the cave. Chu Fengmian's figure retreated and hid in a corner of the valley. He saw that when Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor left the cave, a huge figure rushed out of the cave. This figure was 1,000 feet tall. It was completely white and looked like a wolf. However, there was a pair of wings on its back. It was a desolate beast that rushed out of the cave. Ancient desolate white wolf. Calm. Wonderful bookhouse. Chapter 22:12. Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat when he saw the huge figure. There was an ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal Lord Realm ancient desolation white wolf. Chu Fengmian had guessed that there might be an unparalleled desolate beast hiding in the valley. He did not expect Chu Fengmian to be able to guess it. The ancient desolation white wolf was one of the overlords of the desolate beast race during the Desolate Era. It was one of the most powerful desolate beast races. Once an ancient desolation white wolf reached adulthood, its strength would be at least at the immortal Lord Realm. Such a creature was unimaginable in the current era. The ancient desolation white wolf's strength would be comparable to an immortal Lord Realm ancient desolation white wolf. Some powerful ancient desolation white wolves could even reach the immortal Lord Realm, let alone the immortal Lord Realm. The most powerful Wolf King could even reach the heavenly realm. It could reach the immortal Saint Realm or even the immortal Reverent Realm. The ancient desolation white wolf was a completely different existence from the desolate beasts that Chu Fengmian had encountered before. It was a desolate beast with an incomparably noble bloodline. It was extremely rare even during the Desolate Era. There was actually an ancient desolation white wolf hiding in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal Lord Realm ancient desolation white wolf. It was no wonder that Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor were running away in a hurry. The ancient desolation white wolf could kill an immortal Lord Realm ancient desolation white wolf in a single blow. There was still some blood flowing from the corner of the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth. Apparently, half of the flesh of Xian Sungtian and Flying Sword Emperor had been bitten off by the ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. The fact that Xian Sungtian and Flying Sword Emperor could escape from the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth was already considered extremely cautious. Otherwise, they would have been eaten by the ancient desolation white wolf. Damn it! Ancient desolation white wolf, it's actually an ancient desolation white wolf. Xian Sungtian and Flying Sword Emperor cursed as they escaped from the cave. They quickly ran out of the valley. Escaping from the cave was far from safe for the two of them. The ancient desolation white wolf chased after them. The ancient desolation white wolf had a pair of wings on its back and its flying speed was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he turned into a beam of white light and chased after Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. The ancient desolate white wolf left. Chu Fengmian watched as the ancient desolate white wolf chased after the Flying Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian suddenly felt extremely excited. Since the primordial white wolf had left the cave, it meant that there was no longer any defense in the cave. Furthermore, the unparalleled sword technique was in the cave. This was an excellent opportunity for Chu Fengmian. Fortune comes from danger. Let's go all out. Chu Fengmian moved and flew into the cave without hesitation. He knew that the opportunity would only come in the blink of an eye. With the speed of the ancient desolation white wolf, once it caught up to Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Monarch, they would be killed instantly. Once the ancient desolation white wolf returned, Chu Fengmian would be in extreme danger. The ancient desolation white wolf was comparable to an invincible expert in the immortal realm. Even if Chu Fengmian had passed the Skyman Great Tribulation, he might not be a match for the ancient desolation white wolf, let alone the current Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian might die in the hands of the ancient desolation white wolf. However, since Chu Fengmian had decided to go all out, he had to make the best use of his time. He could not afford to waste a single second. The cave was extremely dark, but Chu Fengmian could barely see the scene inside. Chu Fengmian went all the way to the deepest part of the cave and saw an ancient book placed on a stone platform. On the page of the ancient book, there were two big words, unparalleled. Unparalleled sword technique. This is the unparalleled sword technique. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the unparalleled sword art, he immediately used the battle dragon claw to grab the unparalleled sword art. How dare you steal the sword technique? Die! Just as Chu Fengmian displayed the unparalleled swordsmanship, an angry roar suddenly came from behind. Chu Fengmian hurriedly looked back and saw a huge figure rushing into the cave. It was the ancient desolation white wolf. Almost in a breath's time, the ancient desolation white wolf sensed Chu Fengmian's aura and returned to the cave. Its speed was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Following the ancient desolation white wolf's roar, the surrounding space condensed and turned into sharp blades that slashed at Chu Fengmian. The ancient desolation white wolf was one of the few desolation beasts that majored in space. Its control of space had reached an incredible level. The space around Chu Fengmian was condensed and harder than steel. It was impossible to tear it apart. Chu Fengmian wanted to tear the space apart and escape, but he failed. Damn it! The ancient desolation white wolf is too fast. As long as Chu Fengmian had a second, he could enter the cave, take away the unparalleled sword art, and run away. However, the ancient desolation white wolf was too fast. The moment Chu Fengmian entered the cave, the ancient desolation white wolf rushed back. The sharp blades condensed by space tore the space apart at an extremely fast speed, leaving Chu Fengmian no time to react. Sky devouring. Immortal. In a split second, Chu Fengmian's immortal real body and 129,600 immortal crystals all operated. The immortal secret technique was fully activated, pushing Chu Fengmian's power to the extreme. All the power was injected into the 129,600 immortal crystals to protect Chu Fengmian's body. At the same time, the sky-devouring power burst out and turned into a huge black hole that shrouded Chu Fengmian's body, trying its best to resist the sharp blades that slashed at him. At the same time, the power of Ancestor Jianwang and the power of the mysterious whale burst out from Chu Fengmian's body and were injected into the two swords. The two swords slashed out at the same time. Chu Fengmian unleashed all of his power to resist the sharp blade that was slashing towards him. Rumble. The sharp blades condensed by space contained unimaginable power. Chu Fengmian's sky-devouring secret technique was shattered in an instant. Even though Chu Fengmian controlled the sky-devouring origin and used the sky-devouring secret technique, he could not devour such tyrannical power and was shattered in an instant. The next moment, the sharp blades collided with Chu Fengmian's two swords. Calm. Wonderful Bookhouse. Chapter 2213. Crack! Crack! When the spatial blades collided with Chu Fengmian's swords, Chu Fengmian's body was the first to shatter. Both of Chu Fengmian's arms were instantly shattered by the power that was transmitted over. In Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 immortal crystals formed an invincible defense. Now, the immortal crystals on the edges began to shatter one by one. The primordial Desolation White Wolf was an overlord among the Desolation Beast clan. Its strength was enough to surpass martial artists and demon immortals of the same realm. The power of these spatial blades surpassed any attack Chu Fengmian had ever seen before. If the two spiritual swords in Chu Fengmian's hands were ordinary immortal weapons, they would have broken in an instant. Ordinary immortal weapons couldn't withstand the collision of power. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and the Titanic Godly Sword were once only heaven-grade spiritual weapons, but they had been with Chu Fengmian for a long time. For the first time, Chu Fengmian's strength, transformation, Chu Fengmian's sword intent and strength all poured into the two spiritual swords invisibly. The two spiritual swords had begun to transform into extreme immortal weapons, so they could withstand the bombardment of the spatial blades. The two spiritual swords could withstand it, but Chu Fengmian's body couldn't. His immortal crystals shattered one after another. Immortal. Reconstruct. Enduring the bombardment of the spatial blades, Chu Fengmian roared again and again, pushing his power to the extreme. Countless immortal stones poured into the sky-devouring secret technique at this moment, turning into incomparably pure immortal energy that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The immortal crystals were reconstructed. Each time the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body was broken and reconstructed, the power they contained grew stronger. The primordial Desolation White Wolf had put Chu Fengmian in an extremely dangerous situation, but it could be said that it had stimulated Chu Fengmian's potential. Only in a battle of life and death could a martial artist's true potential be stimulated. Any invincible expert must have defeated countless powerful enemies to have invincible strength. Only after experiencing numerous life and death battles could they transform. Now, as long as Chu Fengmian could escape from the hands of the ancient desolate White Wolf and successfully survive, this battle would be extremely beneficial to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian could also comprehend the power of the immortal monarch and improve his strength. Therefore, at this moment, Chu Fengmian went all out and unleashed all of his bloodline power. The ancestral sky dragon, the heaven-devouring beast, and the black whale, the bloodline power of the three innate divine beasts burst out from Chu Fengmian's body, turning into shadows. Boundless power poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The sword in his hand clashed repeatedly with the spatial blade. Eventually, the spatial blade's power was exhausted and it dissipated. However, even after blocking the spatial blade, Chu Fengmian didn't look relaxed at all. Instead, he looked extremely nervous. This move was just a casual attack for the ancient desolate White Wolf. For the wild beasts, their physical bodies were their most powerful means of attack. The spatial blade condensed from the spatial Tao was only 10% or 20% of the ancient desolate White Wolf's power. The ancient desolate White Wolf returned to the cave in an instant and blocked the entrance. He stared at Chu Fengmian with blood-red eyes. However, when the ancient desolate White Wolf saw the three figures behind Chu Fengmian, he was suddenly stunned. Although it was only for a moment, Chu Fengmian was sharp enough to capture it. Jianwang transformation. In an instant, the power of ancestor Jianwang erupted from Chu Fengmian's body, forcibly tearing the surrounding space apart and entering it in an instant. By the time the ancient desolate White Wolf reacted, Chu Fengmian's figure had already disappeared from the cave. At this time, Chu Fengmian no longer wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Although the unparalleled sword technique was good, it wasn't as important as his life. Chu Fengmian immediately exerted all his strength to activate the escape light and disappeared from the cave. Outside the valley, Chu Fengmian sat on the ground and gasped for breath. The fight with the ancient desolate White Wolf this time was extremely dangerous. Chu Fengmian almost died in the ancient desolate White Wolf's hands. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had condensed the immortal real body, so his physical strength was much stronger than that of immortal generals and immortal marquises. Moreover, the immortal crystals could continuously reconstruct his body. Otherwise, Chu Fengmian would have been killed by the spatial blades just now. Moreover, he was able to escape now. Moreover, Chu Fengmian was able to escape this time because the ancient desolate white wolf was stunned for a moment, which gave him the opportunity to escape. The ancient desolate white wolf was stunned all of a sudden, as if it was intimidated by a force. Chu Fengmian was still thinking about the scene when he escaped. If it wasn't for the ancient desolate white wolf being stunned, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape. Chu Fengmian didn't have the opportunity to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. Chu Fengmian was extremely lucky to be able to escape unscathed this time. Although many of his immortal crystals were shattered, Chu Fengmian still had a large number of immortal stones on him. Chu Fengmian always carried these immortal stones with him, waiting for such a dangerous moment to use the immortal power within them to reconstruct his immortal crystals. Compared to Flying Sword Emperor and Xian, who had half of his body devoured, Chu Fengmian was already extremely lucky this time. At least he could escape unscathed. However, if the ancient desolate white wolf hadn't suddenly stopped, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape unscathed. Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient desolate white wolf's expression. He could tell that the ancient desolate white wolf had sensed something on Chu Fengmian's body that it was extremely afraid of. That was why it was suddenly stunned. Could it be the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast? Chu Fengmian calmed down and almost immediately guessed the reason why the ancient desolate white wolf was so wary. The bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast wasn't simply the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast in Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian's bloodline was also integrated into the heart of the heaven-devouring beast. The origin source of the heaven-devouring beast was flowing in Chu Fengmian's bloodline. The current Chu Fengmian could be considered as a half heaven-devouring beast. It wasn't as simple as the bloodline. End of chapter. Chapter 22:14. Although the ancient desolate white wolf was the overlord of the desolate beast race, it was still a desolate beast. The heaven-devouring beast was the ancestor of the desolate beasts. All the desolate beasts in the world had the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast. The ancient desolate white wolf was no exception. The noble suppression of the bloodline caused the ancient desolate white wolf to be extremely fearful. In the end, Chu Fengmian seized the opportunity to escape. With the heaven-devouring beast bloodline in Chu Fengmian's body, it was enough to suppress many desolate beasts. It was even possible for those desolate beasts to submit to Chu Fengmian. However, the heaven-devouring beast bloodline did not affect the ancient desolate white wolf that much. The ancient desolate white wolf was one of the strongest existences in the desolate beast race. The suppression of the bloodline was also much smaller. Moreover, the strength of the ancient desolate white wolf had surpassed an ordinary ancient desolate white wolf. It had reached the immortal lord realm and its strength was far beyond the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, the ancient desolate white wolf could only suppress Chu Fengmian for a moment when it felt the power of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline. As for the next moment, if Chu Fengmian did not escape, he would have been buried in the wolf's stomach. If Chu Fengmian wanted to use the heaven-devouring beast bloodline to subdue or suppress the ancient desolate white wolf, it was simply impossible. The unparalleled sword principle is actually guarded by an ancient desolate white wolf. The sword sex assessment is actually so crazy? It should be impossible to pass. Chu Fengmian could only be described as crazy towards the sword sex assessment. An immortal lord ancient desolate white wolf was guarding the unparalleled sword principle. To defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, even if Chu Fengmian, Xian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Flying Sword Emperor and dozens of helpers worked together, they would not be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, let alone Chu Fengmian. To the ancient desolate white wolf, Chu Fengmian's strength was only considered as an ant. At most, he would be an annoying ant. There was still a chance for him to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. However, it was impossible for Chu Fengmian and the others to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. Even 100 Chu Fengmians would not be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. This test was almost impossible. It was easy to find the unparalleled sword technique, but it was almost impossible to take it away from the hands of the ancient desolate white wolf. Even Chu Fengmian was somewhat helpless. Xingxuan, do you have any ideas? Helpless, Chu Fengmian could only ask Xing Xian. Xing Xian's understanding of the sword sect far surpassed Chu Fengmian's. Perhaps he had some ideas. There's no other way. Unless you use my real body, you won't be able to fight against the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. However, you haven't passed the test. If you want to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, you'll only end up dead. Xing Xian's voice resounded. The last time you used the bloodless demon sword, I suppressed the majority of its killing intent, so you didn't die. This time, if you use it again, even if you don't die, you will become a monster that only knows how to kill. After Xing Xian finished speaking, his voice disappeared. Hearing this, Chu Fengmian felt somewhat helpless. Previously, when facing the ancient desolate white wolf and escaping from it, Chu Fengmian had almost used all his trump cards. If he wanted to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on, his only chance was to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword. When Chu Fengmian attacked the Six Paths Demon Gates and faced celestial demon supremacy, he had used the blood-slaughtering demon sword to kill celestial demon supremacy. Although he had only used the power of the bloodlust demon sword once, Chu Fengmian knew that the power of the bloodlust demon sword was much stronger than many extreme Dao celestial weapons. If he used the blood-slaughtering demon sword, he might be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, Chu Fengmian wanted to ask Xing Xian. However, after hearing Xing Xian's words, Chu Fengmian didn't dare to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword rashly. He didn't dare to disobey Xing Xian's warning. He didn't want to become a sword demon, a monster that only knew how to kill. Every time the blood-slaughtering demon sword appeared in the 9 regions, it would cause a storm of blood. Its former master would become a monster that only knew how to kill. Chu Fengmian didn't want to follow in their footsteps. However, if he didn't use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, Chu Fengmian wouldn't be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf. There must be a way to pass the test since it's called a test. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have set such an impossible test. The purpose of the upper sword sect's appearance and the upper sword execution token was to select a successor to inherit the upper sword sect's sword skills. This stage was the last one. Although it seemed as difficult as ascending to the heavens, there must be a way to pass it. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have spent so much effort to set up this test. Since it was a test, there must be a way to pass it. Let's go and take a look. After Chu Fengmian recovered from his injuries, he gradually approached the valley. This time, he took the risk to follow Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. At least, Chu Fengmian was sure that the unparalleled sword art was in the cave deep in the valley. Moreover, there was an immortal monarch realm ancient desolate white wolf guarding it. Knowing this, Chu Fengmian could come up with a plan. There was no need for him to enter the valley rashly. Chu Fengmian carefully approached the valley and looked at the valley. Now that he knew that there was an ancient desolate white wolf hidden in the valley, he naturally had to be extra careful. Otherwise, if the ancient desolate white wolf chased after him, it wouldn't be easy for Chu Fengmian to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. Chu Fengmian's luck wouldn't be so good every time. As Chu Fengmian approached the valley, there were 2 other figures carefully standing at the edge of the valley and looking at the valley. They were Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Humph! When the 2 of them saw Chu Fengmian's arrival, their eyes revealed a bit of coldness. They had already guessed that Chu Fengmian had hidden himself and followed the 2 of them into the valley when Chu Fengmian rushed into the cave. Now, the 2 of them looked at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent. They couldn't wait to kill Chu Fengmian. Looking at the murderous intent in the eyes of Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian's face was indifferent. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Chu Fengmian didn't care anymore. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the unparalleled sword art and the upper sword sect's inheritance, the first thing he would do was to kill the 2 of them. End of chapter. Chapter 22:15. Putting aside the Flying Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian and Xian Sungtian represented the grudge between the Sword Dao sect and the Tianjian sect. The grudge was as deep as the sea and there was no possibility of reconciliation. No matter who it would be a disaster for the other party to obtain the unparalleled sword principle and the inheritance of the Sword Dao sect. No one would sit back and let the other party obtain the unparalleled sword principle. The atmosphere was extremely cold. Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all standing around the valley. Although everyone knew that the unparalleled sword principle was right in front of them, no one dared to go in and fight for it. Everyone had experienced the power of the ancient desolation White Wolf before. However, they had barely managed to escape from the unparalleled sword principle. No one was willing to throw their lives away if they were not confident. I didn't expect the two of them to be able to escape alive. Chu Fengmian looked at Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor as he thought to himself. When he saw the ancient desolation White Wolf chasing after Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, he was certain that the two of them would be buried in the ancient desolation White Wolf's stomach. However, he did not expect the two of them to be able to escape alive. One should know that Chu Fengmian was able to escape from the ancient desolate White Wolf because of the suppression of the heaven-devouring beast's bloodline. It was impossible for Xian Sungtian and Flying Sword Emperor to possess such means. Could it be that the ancient desolation White Wolf can't leave the valley? Chu Fengmian looked at Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor before looking at the valley again. Suddenly, his eyes emitted a strange light as if he had noticed something. With the strength of the ancient desolation White Wolf, Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all outside the valley. It was naturally impossible to hide from them. However, the ancient desolation White Wolf remained in front of the cave and did not move at all. It did not leave the valley at all. Moreover, when Chu Fengmian was observing the surroundings of the valley, the ancient desolation White Wolf did not appear. The ancient desolation White Wolf would only take action when it entered the valley. It was highly possible that the ancient desolation White Wolf was the guardian beast of the unparalleled sword principle and could not leave the valley. Let's give it a try. Thinking of this, Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and entered the valley. The moment Chu Fengmian entered the valley, a huge white figure suddenly pounced towards Chu Fengmian. It was the ancient desolation White Wolf. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. When he saw the ancient desolation White Wolf move, Chu Fengmian had already retreated out of the valley. Seeing Chu Fengmian leave the valley, the ancient desolate White Wolf coldly snorted. It looked at Chu Fengmian, but it didn't leave the valley and chased after Chu Fengmian. Looks like my guess is correct. The ancient desolate White Wolf cannot leave this valley. Chu Fengmian saw this scene and confirmed his guess. He was 80 to 90% correct. The primordial desolate White Wolf was either unable to leave the valley due to some restrictions, or it was unwilling to leave the valley unless it was absolutely necessary. No matter which point it was a good thing for Chu Fengmian. At least he didn't have to worry about the threat of the ancient desolate White Wolf outside the valley. Xian Sungtian and Flying Sword Emperor seemed to know this, so the two of them stood at the edge of the valley and looked at the ancient desolate White Wolf in the valley while chatting. The unparalleled sword principle was in the valley. As long as one entered the cave in the valley and snatched the unparalleled sword principle, it meant that one had passed the assessment of the Shang Sword sect and obtained the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect. He was only one step away from the ultimate goal. After this step, he would be able to reach the sky in a single bound. However, it was not an easy task to snatch the unparalleled sword principle from the ancient desolate White Wolf. It could even be said that it was extremely difficult. Chu Fengmian thought for a long time but still couldn't think of a way. It was almost impossible to fight the ancient desolate White Wolf head-on. Chu Fengmian knew this clearly. If he wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword principle, he could only think of a way to delay the ancient desolate White Wolf. He could only use his wits and not brute force. However, Chu Fengmian didn't have any ideas at the moment. Time passed by the minutes and seconds. Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all around the valley. They were motionless and seemed to be thinking of a solution. Boom! At this moment, from the deepest part of the valley, in the cave, a shocking sword essence erupted. This sword essence rushed into the 9 heavens. Above the 9 heavens, this sword essence turned into a 7-colored glow. This 7-colored glow could be seen clearly on the entire Jade Desolate Star. The 7-colored glow has appeared. Chu Fengmian saw the appearance of the 7-colored glow and knew that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Once the 7-colored glow appeared, the entire Jade Desolate Star could see it clearly. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor had discovered the location of the unparalleled sword principle in advance, this opportunity was now gone. Within a few minutes after the 7-colored glow appeared, a ray of light flew over from afar. This ray of light was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He came to the surroundings of the valley and saw Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor at a glance. The 3 of you are 1 step ahead of me, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor said with a smile. As the Divine Wood Sword Emperor spoke, he also descended into the surroundings of the valley. His gaze also looked into the valley and saw the white figure lying in front of the cave with a glance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor could see the white beast that was thousands of feet long clearly. Ancient Desolation White Wolf? The moment he saw the Ancient Desolation White Wolf, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's face was extremely ugly. He looked at Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, and the others and immediately understood. Why were Chu Fengmian and the others around the valley but unwilling to enter it? This Ancient Desolation White Wolf was an invincible existence in the entire Jade Desolate Star. Whoever wanted to go against the Ancient Desolation White Wolf would only have a dead end. The voices fell silent again. Everyone was thinking about this countermeasure. Time passed by minute. This unparalleled sword principle is now guarded by the Ancient Desolation White Wolf. No matter who we are no match for this Ancient Desolation White Wolf in a one-on-one fight. If this continues, no one will have the chance to obtain the unparalleled sword principle. End of chapter. Chapter 22:16. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. The person who spoke was Xian Sangtian. He looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and suddenly spoke. Brother Divine Wood, why don't you join forces with us? Join forces? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor's face was as cold as usual. He smiled and said after hearing that. There is only one unparalleled sword principle and only one chance to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not finish his sentence, but the meaning behind his words was very clear. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not want to give up on the upper sword sex inheritance and the unparalleled sword principle. The Flying Sword Emperor was willing to join forces with Xian Sangtian because he knew that he did not have much chance to fight for the upper sword sex inheritance. Hence, he decided to join forces with Xian Sangtian. Of course, there was another reason, which was Chu Fengmian. The Flying Sword Emperor had a grudge against Chu Fengmian and so did Xian Sangtian. If the 2 of them joined forces, they could deal with Chu Fengmian. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had no grudge against Chu Fengmian and he was not willing to rely on the Tianjian sect to give up the upper sword sex inheritance. Naturally, he had no intention of joining forces. Even if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor could not obtain the unparalleled sword principle himself, he did not want to help others obtain it. Brother Divine Wood, if that's the case, I will not force you. After being rejected, Xian Sangtian did not continue to rope him in. He originally wanted to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and get him to lend him a hand so that he could obtain the unparalleled sword art, just like how he roped in the Flying Sword Emperor. Xian Sangtian was born in the Tianjian sect. The Tianjian sect was a legendary sacred region sect that was extremely attractive to sword cultivators in the world. He also wanted to use the Tianjian sect to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. However, unlike the Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor still had the intention of obtaining the upper sword principle. Now, he naturally would not choose to join forces with Xian Sangtian. With the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's attitude, Xian Sangtian would not waste his breath. Everyone was thinking about how they could obtain the unparalleled sword technique. It was easy to obtain the unparalleled sword principle. As long as he could find an opportunity to stall the ancient desolation White Wolf, he could do it. However, while this was easy, it was also the most difficult part. The strength of the ancient desolate White Wolf was something that no one present could resist, let alone delay it. Why don't we rely on our own abilities? Chu Fengmian's mind was filled with countless ideas, but he wasn't confident that he could succeed. He looked over at the others and suddenly spoke. It was impossible for a single person to deal with the ancient desolate White Wolf. In order to deal with the ancient desolate White Wolf, they had to work together. What do you mean by relying on their own abilities? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was the first to respond and said with some interest. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was not willing to assist Xian Sungtian and obtain the unparalleled sword technique, as Xian Sungtian had intended. However, he was interested in Chu Fengmian's words. It's simple. We will work together and attack the valley. Although the ancient desolate White Wolf is powerful, there is only one of it. If we enter together, the ancient desolate White Wolf will not be able to stop all of us. At that time, we will have the opportunity to enter the cave and obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Chu Fengmian said calmly as he looked at Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. However, it was impossible for Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the ancient desolate White Wolf. Now, he had to add the strength of Xian Sungtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. That's easy to say. Let's rely on our own abilities. However, if anyone goes in first, won't they be courting death? Xian Sungtian said coldly after hearing Chu Fengmian's words. Why? Are you planning to make us all work for you? They were only one step away from the ultimate goal. After this step, they would reach the heavens in a single bound. However, it would not be easy to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the ancient desolate White Wolf. It could even be said to be extremely difficult. Chu Fengmian pondered for a long time but could not come up with a solution. It was almost impossible to fight the ancient desolate White Wolf head-on. Chu Fengmian was clear about this. If he wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword technique, he could only think of a way to delay the ancient desolate White Wolf. He could only use his wits and not brute force. However, Chu Fengmian did not have any solution at the moment. Time ticked by. Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all around the valley. They were motionless as if they were thinking of a solution. Boom! At this moment, from the deepest part of the valley, in the cave, a shocking sword essence erupted. This sword essence rushed to the 9 heavens. Above the 9 heavens, this sword essence turned into a 7-colored ray of light. This 7-colored ray of light could be seen clearly on the entire Jade Desolate Star. The 7-colored ray of light has appeared. When Chu Fengmian saw the appearance of the 7-colored ray of light, he knew that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Once the 7-colored ray of light appeared, the entire Jade Desolate Star would be able to see it clearly. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor had discovered the location of the unparalleled sword technique in advance, this opportunity was now gone. Within a few minutes after the 7-colored ray of light appeared, a ray of light flew over from afar. This ray of light was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He came to the surroundings of the valley and saw Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor at a glance. The 3 of you are one step ahead of me. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor said with a smile. As the Divine Wood Sword Emperor spoke, he also descended into the surroundings of the valley. His gaze also looked into the valley and saw the white figure lying in front of the cave with a glance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor could see the white beast that was thousands of feet long clearly. Ancient Desolate White Wolf? The moment he saw the ancient desolate White Wolf, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's face was extremely ugly. He looked at Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, and the others and immediately understood. Why were Chu Fengmian and the others around the valley but unwilling to enter it? This ancient desolate white wolf was an invincible existence on the entire Jade Desolate Star. Whoever wanted to go against the ancient desolate white wolf would only have a dead end. The voices fell silent again. Everyone was thinking about this countermeasure. Time passed by minute. This unparalleled sword technique is now guarded by the ancient desolate white wolf. No matter who we are no match for this ancient desolate white wolf in a one-on-one battle. If this continues, no one will have the chance to obtain the unparalleled sword technique. End of chapter. Chapter 22:17. With the sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao, it's enough to raise your strength by a lot. Hearing the Flying Sword Emperor's words, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's eyes involuntarily revealed a hint of greed. The most valuable treasure on Chufengmian, apart from the Sword Dao Sect's inheritance sword technique, was the Master of Sword Dao's sword intent. Previously in the 9 regions, Chufengmian was able to defeat the Black and White Young Lord and obtain the Supreme Sword Execution Token illustration. This was inseparable from the Master of Sword Dao's sword intent. The Lord of the Sword Dao was an invincible sovereign. Any sword cultivator would benefit immensely if they could comprehend even the slightest bit of the profundities of the sword intent he'd left behind. Not to mention that Chufengmian still had the Sword Dao Sect's inheritance sword technique. The Master of Sword Dao's sword intent alone was a Sword Dao treasure. Even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was tempted. Why? You want to join forces to kill me? Chufengmian looked at the 3 people in front of him. Seeing that the 3 of them were about to join forces, Chufengmian did not look nervous at all. Joining forces is just courting death. If you're not afraid of death, you can give it a try. Chufengmian's tone was casual. Judging from his tone, he did not put the 3 of them in his eyes. When the Divine Wood Sword Emperor heard this tone, he frowned. He looked at Chufengmian with murderous intent in his eyes. Seeing this, Xian Suntian was overjoyed. He had been trying to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had not agreed. However, Chufengmian's words were like adding fuel to the fire. No expert would be willing to be looked down upon like this. Brother Divine Wood, this brat is arrogant. If he obtains the Supreme Sword Sect's inheritance, you and I will be in danger. Hurry up and kill him. Xian Suntian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and said coldly. I promise you that after killing this brat, the Master of Sword Dao's sword intent will all belong to you. All right. Hearing this, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not hesitate at all. He had always yearned for the Master of Sword Dao's sword essence. When he heard the Flying Sword Emperor's words, he was a little hesitant and doubtful. Now that Xian Suntian had spoken, he no longer doubted his words. With Xian Suntian's status, he would never lie to him at such a time. It's easy to break if you're too hard. No matter how talented you are, you'll still die. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor looked at Chufengmian with killing intent in his eyes. Chufengmian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor indifferently. His expression did not change at all because the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Suntian had joined forces. Really? It seems like you've chosen a dead end. Brother Shenmu, don't waste your breath on this brat. Just kill him. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor wanted to say something, but Xian Suntian suddenly shouted coldly. In an instant, Xian Suntian attacked. He had been accumulating this power for a long time because he wanted to kill Chufengmian. In his heart, Chufengmian had always been a thorn in his side. When he came to the Jade Desolate Star, Xian Suntian had always had a plan to kill Chufengmian. Xian Suntian originally planned to obtain the unparalleled sword principle and then obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Then, he would let the sword reverse attack and kill Chufengmian. However, this path was no longer feasible. In that case, he chose the second path, which was to join forces with the Divine Wood Sword Emperor to kill Chufengmian. Although Chufengmian's strength was much stronger than he had imagined, he was confident that he could kill Chufengmian since he had the Divine Wood Sword Emperor on his side. Although Chufengmian's Sword Dao was at the peak of Sword Dao, Chufengmian's realm was only at the half-step celestial realm after all. Moreover, Xian Suntian had his own trump card. The moment he had the divine wood sword emperor on his side, Xian Suntian immediately attacked. The spiritual sword in his hand was unsheathed. In an instant, the sword flashed and thousands of sword edges slashed towards Chu Fengmian from all directions. The power of this sword was unleashed with Xian Suntian's full strength. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian with this sword. The tip of the sword that contained endless killing intent descended from the sky. The entire valley was enveloped by endless sword intent, turning into a sword domain in an instant. All the trees within 100-mile radius were pulverized by the might of the sword. Xian Suntian's full-strength sword. Previously, Xian Suntian had never displayed his strength. However, he had passed the 9th level of the sword testing stone after all. Xian Suntian's strength was self-evident. Moreover, his realm was far beyond Chu Fengmian's. He was at the Immortal General Realm. With the strength of the Immortal General Realm, he was able to unleash such a terrifying sword intent. The power of this sword had surpassed most of the Immortal Lords and was close to the Immortal King realm. One sword annihilation. Chu Fengmian muttered. Xian Suntian had used the Tianjian sect sword principle, the killing move of the flying celestial sword principle, one sword annihilation. This move was the move with the strongest killing intent in the flying celestial sword principle. It was an absolute killing move. The power of this sword enveloped the area and all living things within 100 miles perished. Hiss. Xian Suntian was not the only one. At this moment, the Flying Sword Emperor, who was beside him, also attacked. Although the Flying Sword Emperor's sword principle was not as powerful as Xian Suntian's sword annihilation, it was still able to fully display his strength. All of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of sword lights shot out from the Flying Sword Emperor's sword. His body had turned invisible. He merged with the thousands of sword lights and seemed to have turned into a sword, controlling the thousands of sword lights. Although the Flying Sword Emperor was not as powerful as Xian Suntian, he was not much weaker than Xian Suntian to be able to reach the final step of the Upper Sword Sect assessment. The two sword lights suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. Xian Suntian and the Flying Sword Emperor had already accumulated their strength and were waiting for the opportunity to attack. In an instant, they attacked and unleashed all the strength that they had accumulated. Buzz! The two sword lights descended. The sword aura filled the sky and turned the area within 100 miles into a sword world. Any living things that entered the sword world would be torn to shreds by the violent sword essence. Buzz! Buzz! The two sword lights shrouded the area and they were enough to crush everything. You want to compete with me in sword principle? Chu Fengmian sneered and sneered. He then pulled out the two swords from his hands. The moment Chu Fengmian held the two spiritual swords tightly. Shocking sword aura shot up to the sky from Chu Fengmian's back. The power of the sword suppressed the power of the two sword lights in the sky. End of chapter. Chapter 22:18. The sword power that erupted from Chu Fengmian's body alone surpassed the combined sword power of Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor. This was Chu Fengmian's true strength. Even in the 9 regions, Chu Fengmian had never used his true strength before. Now that he was in Jade Desolate Star, the battle and energy fluctuations could not be transmitted to the outside world. To Chu Fengmian, it was enough for Chu Fengmian to use his full strength. After Chu Fengmian left Book Collection Pavilion, this was the first time he fought with someone after his strength had skyrocketed. At this moment, in Chu Fengmian's body, the countless sword skills that were recorded in the ancient Book of Sword Principle turned into supreme sword intent and supported Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian looked at the two sword lights that descended from the sky and his eyes were cold. In terms of sword skills, Chu Fengmian was never afraid of anyone. Break it! Chu Fengmian roared. Thousands of sword intent erupted from his body and gathered on the sword blades in Chu Fengmian's hands. At this moment, he clasped his hands together and the two swords became one. Suddenly, the sword slashed towards the sky. The pure sword power that erupted from the sword blade soared into the sky. Boom! Boom! The two sword blades collided in the sky and the sky was filled with the sound of the sword whistling. Bam! In an instant, the two sword lights that were unleashed by Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor were crushed and destroyed in an instant. Boundless sword power suddenly turned into a sword or a river and swept towards Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian had the upper hand even when he was fighting against two people. Xian Suntian's and Flying Sword Emperor's faces changed drastically. They desperately activated the power of the swords in their hands and threw out countless swords to resist the power of the sword Qi River. However, their combined strength was far from being able to resist Chu Fengmian's full blow. 7 Ju! Swoosh! However, at this moment, a sense of danger flashed across Chu Fengmian's mind and caused him to retreat continuously. Even the sword or a river that was condensed completely dissipated at this moment. A sword light suddenly slashed out from the depths of the void. The sword light came from Divinewood Sword Emperor. When Chu Fengmian was chasing after Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor, Divinewood Sword Emperor suddenly attacked. His figure entered the depths of the void and hid the sword light that was slashing towards Chu Fengmian. He suddenly reacted when he got close to Chu Fengmian. This sword light seemed ordinary, but each time he looked at it, it displayed a different stance. Sword of Great Omen. 7 Ju! Chu Fengmian's expression abruptly changed. The might of this sword seemed to have exceeded his expectations. One sword was sword emperor was sword emperor sword was sword emperor was swordsmanship sword. This move of the 7 fatalities required a large number of living beings to be refined with the blood of living beings. Only then could it unleash its true power. Because the sword technique was stained with the blood of millions of living beings, it was called the Great Ominous Sword. Even in the ancient times, the 7 fatalities was seen as a forbidden art. It was despised by sword cultivators, and no one was willing to cultivate it. Only sword cultivators who walked on demon Dao would cultivate sword emperor. Chu Fengmian didn't expect Divinewood Sword Emperor to know sword emperor. Furthermore, looking at the might of this sword light, the Divinewood Sword Emperor had clearly cultivated this sword to the greater success stage. In order to cultivate sword 7 Ju to great achievement, there were at least hundreds of millions of lives that had died under the power of the sword. From the outside, the Divinewood Sword Emperor looked like an ordinary sword cultivator who was infatuated with the way of the sword. However, it was hard to imagine that the Divinewood Sword Emperor had actually cultivated such a ferocious sword technique and even cultivated it to the great accomplishment stage. Not only Chu Fengmian, but even Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor were shocked when they saw the Divinewood Sword Emperor unleashing the sword move. The moment Xian Suntian roped in Divinewood Sword Emperor, he immediately attacked. He unsheathed the spiritual sword in his hand and the sword flashed. Thousands of sword edges slashed towards Chu Fengmian from all directions. Xian Suntian unleashed the full power of this sword strike, intending to kill Chu Fengmian in one strike. The tip of the sword that contained endless killing intent descended from the sky. The entire valley was enveloped by endless sword intent, turning into a sword domain in an instant. All the trees within 100-mile radius were pulverized by the might of the sword. Xian Suntian's full power sword. Previously, Xian Suntian had never displayed his strength. However, he had passed the 9th level of the sword testing stone after all. Xian Suntian's strength was self-evident. Moreover, his cultivation realm was far beyond Chu Fengmian's. He was in the Immortal General Realm. With the strength of the Immortal General Realm, he was able to unleash such a terrifying sword intent. The power of the sword had surpassed most immortal lords and was close to the Immortal King Realm. Sword annihilation. Chu Fengmian muttered. What Xian Suntian used was the Sky Sword Sect's signature sword technique, the Flying Immortal Sky Sword Technique's killing move, One Sword Annihilation. This move was the move with the heaviest killing intent in the sword skill. It was an absolute killing move. The power of the sword enveloped the area and all life within 100 miles perished. Hiss. Xian Suntian was not the only one. At this moment, the Flying Sword Emperor beside him also attacked. Although the Flying Sword Emperor's sword skill was not as powerful as Xian Suntian's sword annihilation, it still displayed his strength to the fullest. All of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of sword lights shot out from the flying sword emperor's sword. His body had turned invisible. He merged with the thousands of sword lights as if he had turned into the sword edge and controlled the thousands of sword lights. Although the flying sword emperor's strength was not as great as Qian's, he was not much weaker than Qian's. The two sword lights suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. Qian and the flying sword emperor had already accumulated their strength and were waiting for the opportunity to attack. In an instant, they attacked and unleashed all the strength that they had accumulated. Buzz! The two sword lights descended. The sword power filled the sky and turned the area within 100 miles into a sword world. Any life that entered the sword world would be torn to shreds by the violent sword intent. Buzz! Buzz! The two sword lights shrouded the area and they were enough to crush everything. You want to compete with me in sword skills? Chu Fengmian sneered disdainfully. He shouted coldly and pulled out the two swords from his hands. The moment Chu Fengmian held the two spiritual swords tightly. Shocking sword power shot up to the sky from Chu Fengmian's back. The power of the sword suppressed the power of the two sword lights in the sky. End of chapter. Chapter 22:19. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor let out a long roar as a shocking sword intent erupted from his back and instantly condensed into the spiritual sword in his hand. Boom! Boom! The aura of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor rose crazily as the power in his body skyrocketed step by step. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor, who had been hiding his strength, unleashed his full strength at this moment. Mysterious Heaven Realm. Immortal Lord Realm. The power that erupted from the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had far surpassed the level of the Celestial Realm and stepped into the mysterious Heaven Realm, the Immortal Lord Realm. Even with the current strength of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, he was already at the peak of the Immortal Lord Realm. Peak of the Immortal Lord Realm. This was the strength of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. There had always been rumors that the strength of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had already broken through the Immortal General Realm and stepped into the Immortal Lord Realm. However, the true strength that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor displayed was even more powerful than the rumors. Peak of the Immortal Lord Realm and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's sword techniques. His strength was almost comparable to an immortal king. Boom! The Divine Wood Sword Emperor raised the sword in his hand as thousands of immortal power sword intents were injected into it. Suddenly, a dazzling light shone as the sword slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The sword light was dazzling as it danced wildly in the sky. Thousands of immortal power sword intents were all condensed on the sword as it slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The power of this sword was much stronger than the combined power of Qian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Peak of the Immortal Lord Realm. Chu Fengmian's expression changed abruptly. Although he had already guessed that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was extremely terrifying, Chu Fengmian still did not expect his strength to reach such a level. The power of this sword was comparable to an Immortal Lord Realm at the peak of the Immortal Lord Realm. Such strength was not to be underestimated. Even in the sacred region where experts were as common as clouds, an immortal king was definitely an expert who could run amok in an area. The power of this sword was simply unstoppable even if dozens of immortal generals joined forces. Ordinary immortal generals would be swept away. Even Chu Fengmian's expression became incomparably serious. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. Chu Fengmian's bloodline power was fully activated. The illusory figures of the Xianjing and Jianwang congregated and fell into Chu Fengmian's sword. Dragon Whale shatters the sea. The power of Xianjing and Tianlong, the two connate sacred beasts, gathered in Chu Fengmian's sword. The two forces blended in Chu Fengmian's hand and erupted in an instant. This move was none other than the dragon whale shattering the sea that Chu Fengmian had created with the power of the dragon whale. However, Chu Fengmian had integrated the previous fist technique into the ancient book of swordsmanship, turning it into a sword technique. Chu Fengmian was a sword cultivator. His swordsmanship was his strongest technique. Now, the dragon whale shattering the sea was executed with his swordsmanship. Its power was even greater than before. The dragon roared as a boundless and violent power swept through everything. The power of the dragon whale swept down and collided with the divine wood sword emperor's sword in the air. The power of this sword could be said to be the pinnacle of immortal techniques. If it was in the hands of others, they would not be able to display such heaven-defying power. But now, Chu Fengmian had inherited the power of the two connate sacred beasts, Jianwang and Xianjing. The move that Chu Fengmian used was his strongest move. It carried the power of the two connate sacred beasts. Rumble! The sword formed by the dragon whale shattering the sea collided with the sword slashed by the divine wood sword emperor in the air, setting off a series of collisions. This sword that was comparable to an immortal king's attack was blocked by Chu Fengmian. The power of two connate sacred beasts. The divine wood sword emperor could also clearly feel the terrifying power that came from Chu Fengmian's bloodline. Chu Fengmian's concealment was far beyond his expectations. Sword sweeping 8 desolation. However, at this moment, the divine wood sword emperor was still extremely calm. After the sword was blocked, the divine wood sword emperor attacked again. The sword intent condensed into a sword light that was 10,000 feet long. It descended majestically and swept across the 8 desolation. As the sword swept down, even the 100 feet of space around Chu Fengmian was sucked in and shattered. Yin-yang reversal, 3 suns breaking the sky. Just as the sword light swept down, Chu Fengmian roared angrily. From behind him, an incomparably huge yin-yang formation suddenly appeared. The boundless and violet power that represented the strongest power in the world suddenly condensed in the sword in Chu Fengmian's hand. The sword suddenly slashed out. One of the Supreme Sword Sect's 12 Supreme Sword Techniques, the strongest move in the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. Chu Fengmian killed the sword spirit of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex in the library and integrated the Yin-Yang Sword Codex into the ancient sword technique. Now, Chu Fengmian could use it at any time. The vast and violent power slashed out along with Chu Fengmian's sword. The power of this sword was not weaker than the divine wood sword emperor's sword sweeping 8 desolation. When the two forces collided in the air, the aftermath was enough to kill some warriors in the celestial realm. A genius who can withstand 3 of my swords at the half-step celestial realm. I have never seen such a genius in the sword Dao. Seeing that the sword was neutralized, the divine wood sword emperor looked at Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with amazement. With his strength, even among the warriors and demon gods of the same realm, there were very few who could withstand 3 of his swords. Unfortunately, I can't let you live today. The divine wood sword emperor's eyes were extremely cold. He attacked again. He was a sword cultivator expert who had been famous for a long time in the extraterritorial starry sky. Each of his sword techniques had been cultivated to the level of great success. In an instant, the sword in his hand flashed again and again. Thousands of sword techniques slashed down in an instant. These thousands of sword techniques seemed different, but they were of the same origin. 1000 Transformation Sword Technique. Chu Fengmian recognized the origin of this sword at a glance. The 1000 Transformation Sword art was a sword art created by the 1000 Transformation Sword Sovereign, a famous sword art recorded in ancient records. He comprehended millions of sword arts and condensed them all into one sword art, which was the 1000 Transformation Sword art. The power of this sword was ever-changing. In some ancient books, the evaluation of the 1000 Transformation Sword technique was not inferior to the Immortal Emperor Sword technique. Not only was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor unbelievably powerful, but the sword techniques he knew were as many as the stars in the sky. Every one of them had reached the level of great success. When this sword slashed down, it was comparable to thousands of sword techniques. Obviously, this 1000 Transformation Sword technique had been comprehended to the level of great success in the hands of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. End of chapter. Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Mysterious Firmament, Flying Sword Emperor. At this moment, the 3 sword cultivators all unleashed their full strength and used all their trump cards to besiege and kill Chu Fengmian. Tens of thousands of swords instantly trapped Chu Fengmian and tore his body apart. Kid, you will definitely die today. Xian Suntian looked at Chu Fengmian ferociously. As for the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, although they did not speak, they looked at Chu Fengmian as though they were looking at a dead man when they saw that he was surrounded by tens of thousands of swords. In their hearts, Chu Fengmian was definitely going to die this time around. Definitely going to die. Chu Fengmian roared with a cold gaze as he condensed his power to resist the attacks from the surrounding swords. Break! One sword, sky-splitting. Above Chu Fengmian's head, the Ancient Sword Principle Book suddenly appeared. The first page of the Ancient Sword Principle Book opened abruptly and the words 9 regions were written in it. Suddenly, Boundless Sword Will was released from the Ancient Sword Principle Book and condensed on Chu Fengmian's sword. The Ancient Sword Principle Book was the condensation of Chu Fengmian's lifetime of sword will. It recorded tens of thousands of swords and Chu Fengmian had created his own sword principle from it. It was also his strongest sword. Sky-splitting. Chu Fengmian roared again and again. The two swords joined together and slashed out. A sword light suddenly burst out and released boundless sword power. The sword did not contain any technique but was purely power. It was a sword that could split heaven and earth apart. The first move of the 9 region sword principle, sky-splitting. It was also the strongest sword that Chu Fengmian had created. Boom! 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 The sword light suddenly slashed out and collided with the countless swords surrounding Chu Fengmian. In an instant, the tens of thousands of swords and countless sword will were shattered. The sword edge that was formed by the Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian, the 3 sword cultivator experts, was torn apart bit by the sword. The power of the sword was worthy of the name sky-splitting. It could even tear heaven and earth apart, let alone a small sword. They watched as the sword edge was torn apart by the power of the heaven-splitting sword move. It was almost a hopeless situation. This sky-splitting sword had forcibly opened up an impossible path. Under the joint efforts of these 3 people, a gap was forcibly torn open and the sword edge condensed by these 3 people. Oh no! The Flying Sword Emperor, Xian Sangtian, and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's faces changed drastically. In the eyes of the 3 of them, Chu Fengmian was already a dead man. They did not expect Chu Fengmian to be able to tear a gap in the sword will that had enveloped them in such a hopeless situation. After a brief moment of surprise, the 3 of them immediately made their move. They immediately unleashed countless swords in the direction of that gap, and once again trapped Chu Fengmian within the encirclement of swords. You still want to trap me? Chu Fengmian's conveyance light was faster than their speed. In an instant, Chu Fengmian turned into a conveyance light and immediately got out of the sword. However, just as Chu Fengmian escaped from the sword's encirclement through the gap, the sky was suddenly filled with swords that slashed towards him. The swords that Xian Sangtian, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had unleashed slashed towards him again. Although the swords were not as powerful as the previous ones, they still contained a great amount of power. Chu Fengmian saw the swords slashing towards him, but the conveyance light did not stop at all. He immediately rushed towards the swords. He also knew that if he were to fall into the encirclement of Xian Sangtian, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor again, that would be the real danger. He could escape once, but he might not be able to escape a second time. End of chapter. Chapter 22-21. Even though there were thousands of swords in front of him, Chu Fengmian could only endure and pass through them. I am immortal. In Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 immortal crystals all gathered together and formed a huge crystal that could withstand all attacks. His body showed some signs of crystallization, and the power of the immortal true body was pushed to the extreme. In an instant, Chu Fengmian turned into an escape light and rushed into the oncoming swords. Boom! 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 The swords bombarded Chu Fengmian's body, and the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body shook violently. Under the impact of the swords, they shook violently. Vaguely, the condensed invincible defense was about to shatter. Condense. Immortal stones, burn. Reconstruct the true body. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's empty ring was opened abruptly, and all the immortal stones were taken out by Chu Fengmian. In an instant, they were burned and turned into extremely pure immortal power that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. Under the infusion of these immortal powers, some of the immortal crystals that were about to shatter were restored again. The swords slashed on Chu Fengmian's body, but now, Chu Fengmian's physical body was able to withstand them. Let's go! Beyond these swords, Chu Fengmian's body did not stop at all, and in an instant, he turned into an escape light and flew away. Chase! Xian Sangtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor saw Chu Fengmian fly away, and in an instant, they also activated their escape light and chased after Chu Fengmian. This time, the three of them joined forces to besiege Chu Fengmian, and they had already made up their minds to kill him. Today, no matter where Chu Fengmian escaped to, they would continue to pursue and kill Chu Fengmian. Now that Chu Fengmian had turned into an escape light, they did not panic. Even if Chu Fengmian escaped, he would not be able to escape far, and could only stay on the Jade Desolate Star. The spirit arrays left behind by the upper sword sect above the Jade Desolate Star were not something they could pass through with their strength. Xian Sangtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and the others had been fighting in this place, and they had also calculated this point. In this Jade Desolate Star, even if Chu Fengmian escaped, it would be useless. This brat took our swords head-on. He can't run far. Xian Sangtian's eyes were cold and filled with killing intent. He could tell that even though Chu Fengmian had forcefully withstood their attacks, he had also sustained significant injuries. Even if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were to forcefully resist such a sword edge, he would be severely injured. It was already beyond their expectations that Chu Fengmian could still use the escape light to escape. However, they were on the Jade Desolate Star. Although they had failed to kill Chu Fengmian, they were not in a hurry. After all, Chu Fengmian could not escape no matter what. As long as he was on the Jade Desolate Star, Chu Fengmian would always be their prey. Sooner or later, he would die in their hands. Chu Fengmian was well aware of this. In this Jade Desolate Star, no matter where Chu Fengmian escaped, it would be meaningless. Sooner or later, he would be caught by the three people again. The space around the Jade Desolate Star was completely sealed. Even if Chu Fengmian had the bloodline of ancestor Jianwang, it was impossible for him to break through the countless restrictions and formations left behind by the upper sword sect and escape. Chu Fengmian had long known this. His goal was very clear from the beginning. Chu Fengmian's escape light suddenly changed direction and flew in the direction of the valley. This valley was where the ancient desolate white wolf was located. What is this brat doing? Is he going to commit suicide? Looking in the direction of Chu Fengmian's escape light, Xian Sangtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were shocked. At this time, whoever dared to rush into the valley rashly was no different from courting death, not to mention that Chu Fengmian was seriously injured. Rushing into the valley at this time was simply delivering meat to the ancient desolate white wolf. It was a suicidal action. Oh no, this brat doesn't want the Sword Dao Sect sword techniques to fall into our hands. In an instant, Xian Sangtian understood Chu Fengmian's action and said anxiously, "Damn it! Stop him!" The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was anxious when he heard this. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was willing to join forces with Xian Sangtian to besiege Chu Fengmian because of the Sword Dao Sect sword techniques and the sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao. However, if Chu Fengmian really entered the valley today and died in the hands of the ancient desolate white wolf, they would not be able to obtain any of these. In this way, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Sangtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor would not be able to obtain anything after paying such a high price and using all their trump cards. Stop him! The Flying Sword Emperor was even more anxious. Compared to Xian Sangtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, he had paid a higher price. In order to deal with Chu Fengmian, he did not hesitate to use an Immortal Emperor paper sword. Now that the sword intent on the Immortal Emperor paper sword had completely dissipated, the Immortal Emperor paper sword had become a piece of trash. If he really could not obtain anything from Chu Fengmian, he would suffer a double loss this time. You want my swordsmanship? The sword intent of the master of sword Dao. Dream on. Chu Fengmian turned around and looked at the three people with anxious faces. The corners of his mouth curled into a sarcastic smile. His eyes revealed a hint of decisiveness as he rushed out of the valley at an extremely fast speed. What should we do? Seeing that Chu Fengmian was about to enter the valley, Xian Suntian's face kept changing. He did not want to give up on the sword Dao Sect's inheritance that Chu Fengmian possessed. However, once he entered the valley, he would have to face the ancient desolate white wolf, which was extremely dangerous. He did not dare to rashly enter by himself. His gaze involuntarily turned towards the other two. Chase! The Divine Wood Sword Emperor roared and immediately chased after Chu Fengmian. He was also about to enter the valley. He had spent so much effort today and he was not willing to return empty-handed. The Flying Sword Emperor did the same and immediately chased after Chu Fengmian. Seeing this, Xian Suntian did not hesitate and immediately activated his flying light. The three flying lights chased after Chu Fengmian all the way. Even when Chu Fengmian reached the edge of the valley, none of them slowed down. They had already made up their minds that even if Chu Fengmian wanted to enter the valley, they would still chase after Chu Fengmian. Seeing this, Chu Fengmian's lips curled into an imperceptible smile. His flying light suddenly flew into the valley. Roar! Just as Chu Fengmian's flying light entered the valley, a huge figure had already pounced on Chu Fengmian. It was the ancient desolate white wolf. Come. Wonderful bookhouse. Chapter 22-22. The speed of the ancient desolation white wolf was unimaginably fast. Just as Chu Fengmian flew into the valley, it suddenly pounced on Chu Fengmian. It opened its bloody mouth and tried to swallow Chu Fengmian. This wasn't Chu Fengmian's first time fighting the ancient desolation white wolf. However, Chu Fengmian was still taken aback by the speed of the ancient desolation white wolf. The moment the ancient desolation white wolf opened its mouth, it immediately used the law of space. The space around Chu Fengmian condensed. The moment the ancient desolation white wolf opened its mouth, it wanted to devour the space around Chu Fengmian. The power of this move was similar to the power of the sky-devouring secret technique. The ancient desolation white wolf possessed the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast and also inherited a part of the sky-devouring Dao. Even an immortal marquis would find it difficult to resist this devouring move. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared the moment he entered the valley. The power of the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast erupted from his body and a huge shadow of the sky-devouring beast appeared behind him. The moment the shadow of the sky-devouring beast appeared, Chu Fengmian felt the pressure around him lessen significantly. After all, the ancient desolation white wolf was a desolate beast. Even if its strength was far superior to Chu Fengmian's, the suppression of the bloodline couldn't be unaffected. Especially now that Chu Fengmian didn't just possess the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast. He had also fused the heart of the sky-devouring beast into his bloodline. Now that Chu Fengmian had control over the sky-devouring origin, he was like a small sky-devouring beast. Chu Fengmian could easily neutralize 90% of the power of the ancient desolation white wolf's devouring move and shatter it completely. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure flew past the ancient desolation white wolf. Chu Fengmian could use the power of the sky-devouring to suppress the ancient desolation white wolf, but if he were to face it head-on, it would be no different from courting death. The moment the sky-devouring power temporarily suppressed the ancient desolation white wolf, Chu Fengmian immediately flew past it and into the depths of the valley. Roar! Seeing Chu Fengmian slip away from his side, the ancient desolate white wolf was enraged to the extreme. He felt that Chu Fengmian's strength was just like an ant in front of him. But now, Chu Fengmian had escaped from his hands again and again, which made him furious to the extreme. However, every time Chu Fengmian used the heaven-devouring origin source, the power of the bloodline would suppress him, making it impossible for him to stop Chu Fengmian. Just as the ancient desolate white wolf was about to chase after Chu Fengmian in anger, 3 streaks of light followed closely behind and rushed into the valley. However, right after they entered the ravine, what they saw was a furious ancient desolate white wolf. Not good. Get out. The moment they saw the ancient desolation white wolf, Xian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and the others changed their minds and immediately prepared to leave the valley. However, right at that moment, an imprint platform suddenly enveloped the sky above the ravine. That imprint platform possessed the power to control the surrounding space. The entire ravine was controlled by the imprint platform and the surrounding space was completely sealed. That imprint platform was the life imprint. Just as Xian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Flying Sword Emperor entered the ravine, the life imprint suddenly flew up and shrouded the ravine, sealing the space in the ravine. Chu Fengmian had been waiting for this moment. Chu Fengmian did not enter the ravine to seek his own death. His goal had always been the unparalleled sword principle. However, Chu Fengmian also knew that it was impossible for him to snatch the unparalleled sword principle from the ancient desolate white wolf by himself. Therefore, from the beginning, Chu Fengmian had planned to use Xian and the others to help Chu Fengmian obtain the life imprint. Although the ancient desolate white wolf was powerful, there was only one of it and it could only deal with one martialist at a time. Now, Xian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor were all lured into the ravine. Chu Fengmian wanted them to delay the ancient desolate white wolf so that Chu Fengmian would have a chance to snatch the unparalleled sword principle. Of course, it was impossible for Xian and the others to help Chu Fengmian willingly. Therefore, Chu Fengmian deliberately retreated and pretended to be weak. He wanted to lure Xian and the others into the ravine. Now that the three of them had been lured over, it was time to reel in the net. The life imprint had sealed the space around the ravine. It was easy for Xian and the others to enter the ravine, but it would be difficult for them to leave. Oh no, we fell into his trap. The three of them sensed that something was wrong when they saw the raging ancient desolate white wolf. Now that they saw the life imprint sealing the entire ravine, the three of them instantly understood that they had fallen into Chu Fengmian's trap. Chu Fengmian wanted them to tangle with the ancient desolate white wolf so that he could reap the benefits and snatch the unparalleled sword principle. Let's go. Let's leave the ravine. We can't let that kid succeed. Xian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor immediately understood. They turned around and prepared to leave the ravine. Once they left the ravine, the ancient desolate white wolf would definitely chase after the ancient desolate white wolf. They would rather give up the sword principle inheritance that Chu Fengmian had than watch Chu Fengmian obtain the unparalleled sword principle and the sword principle inheritance. However, they stopped when they were near the edge of the ravine. The entire ravine was enveloped by the life imprint. Although the sealing of the life imprint was nothing to them, Xian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were preparing to gather their power to break the sealing of the life imprint. However, at that moment, a huge white figure had already charged over. The raging ancient desolate white wolf was about to tear and devour everyone in front of it. In its rage, it charged towards the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the others. Danger! The Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian, and the Flying Sword Emperor activated their sword principle and immediately slashed towards the ancient desolate white wolf. However, the streaks of sword light were unable to withstand a single blow from the ancient desolate white wolf. The ancient desolate white wolf's huge wolf claws swept down and instantly, all the sword lights were shattered. Both Xian and Flying Sword Emperor took a few steps back as their faces turned pale. End of chapter. Chapter 22-23. Kill. Xian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor unleashed all their power to resist the ancient desolate white wolf's attack. If they were outside the seal, they would only need to accumulate some energy to easily break it. But now, the sealing of the Great Life Seal was like a nightmare to them. In the valley, they had to face the continuous attacks of the ancient desolate white wolf. They did not even have the time to accumulate power. If they did not defend with all their might, they would be eaten by the wolf in the next moment. Now, even if Xian, Flying Sword Emperor and Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not want to help Chu Fengmian delay the ancient desolate white wolf. They had to deal with it with all their might. Otherwise, they would be buried in the wolf's stomach before Chu Fengmian even died. Deep in the valley, Chu Fengmian's conveyance light flew all the way to the deepest cave. He could already feel the fluctuation of spiritual power behind him. Xian Suntian and the other two were already entangled with the ancient desolate white wolf. The three of them were delaying the ancient desolate white wolf, giving Chu Fengmian the best opportunity to seize the unparalleled sword principle. Let's go! Chu Fengmian's conveyance light was extremely fast as he entered the valley. It was a rare opportunity and Chu Fengmian did not dare to be careless. He was not sure how long the three of them could delay the ancient desolate white wolf. Given the ancient desolate white wolf's strength, as long as the three of them showed a slight flaw, they would definitely die. Chu Fengmian was able to trick the three of them this time because he showed his weakness previously. He only succeeded because the three of them had lowered their guard. This was the only chance. There would not be such a chance next time. Chu Fengmian's conveyance light entered the cave. It was not his first time entering the cave and he was very familiar with the structure of the cave. He went all the way to the deepest part of the cave. His gaze landed on one of the stone platforms. The unparalleled sword principle was placed on the stone platform. Give it to me. Chu Fengmian's mind flickered and a battle dragon claw formed above his head. He suddenly clawed at the unparalleled sword principle. The unparalleled sword principle was placed on the stone platform and it was extremely quiet. However, the moment Chu Fengmian's battle dragon claw approached, the unparalleled sword technique seemed to have suddenly awakened. A shocking sword essence burst out from the ancient book. The sword essence condensed into sharp spiritual swords and slashed at Chu Fengmian. Although the unparalleled sword principle did not give birth to a sword spirit, its power was much more powerful than the sword spirits that Chu Fengmian's power that he had seen in the library pavilion. This sword will was so strong that when it burst out, it was close to being corporeal as it slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The unparalleled sword art was one of the top 10 heavenly sword arts of antiquity times. Not everyone was qualified to obtain it. Just like the extreme way immortal weapon, only those who passed his trial were qualified to master the unparalleled sword art. Tens of millions of spiritual swords formed by the sword intent slashed at Chu Fengmian from all directions. The trajectory of each spiritual sword even contained the posture of this swordsmanship, which made Chu Fengmian feel that he was not facing a book of swordsmanship at all, but a real swordsman. If the unparalleled sword principle could really give birth to a sword spirit, the sword spirit would definitely become one of the most powerful sword cultivators in the world. So powerful! Chu Fengmian exclaimed. He did not expect a sword principle book to be so powerful. Even an ordinary immortal marquis would be in danger if the spiritual swords slashed down one after another. However, Chu Fengmian was prepared. He had spent a lot of effort subduing the sword spirits in the library pavilion. Naturally, he did not dare to underestimate the unparalleled sword principle. Rays of sword light suddenly flew out from Chu Fengmian's body. These rays of sword light were all golden spiritual swords. They were the 2815 Supreme Sword Chi. These Supreme Sword Chi flew out from Chu Fengmian's body and immediately turned into a Supreme Sword formation, condensing in front of Chu Fengmian. The spiritual swords formed by the sword essence that burst out from the unparalleled sword technique slashed at the Supreme Sword array and shattered. Chu Fengmian used the Supreme Sword formation to deal with the sword intent of the unparalleled sword principle. He also condensed sword intent and shrouded the unparalleled sword principle. He wanted to subdue and collect the unparalleled sword principle. Boom! The sword intent that broke out in the valley could be clearly felt by the entire valley and even the entire Jade Wilderness Star. Oh no, that kid is collecting the unparalleled sword principle. Stop him, we can't let him succeed. In the valley, the three people who were still fighting with the ancient desolation white wolf, trying to find a chance to escape, suddenly felt the burst of sword intent. Their expressions changed abruptly. They also knew that they could not let Chu Fengmian collect the unparalleled sword principle no matter what. If Chu Fengmian collected the unparalleled sword principle, the three of them would definitely die. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the supreme sword sect's inheritance, the first people he would kill would be them. You guys delay the ancient desolation White Wolf, I'll kill that kid. Xian Suntian roared and immediately pulled himself out. He stopped fighting with the ancient desolation White Wolf and flew towards the cave. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the Flying Sword Emperor nodded and immediately used all their trump cards to resist the ancient desolation White Wolf's attack. Originally, when the three of them joined forces, it was already extremely difficult for them to face the ancient desolation White Wolf. Now that Xian Suntian was gone, it was even more dangerous. However, it was obviously more important to stop Chu Fengmian from obtaining the unparalleled sword principle. Xian Suntian's escape light was extremely fast. He rushed into the cave and immediately saw Chu Fengmian, who was collecting the unparalleled sword art in the depths of the cave. The spiritual sword in his hand flickered and thousands of sword arts slashed toward Chu Fengmian. You want to stop me? It's too late. Chu Fengmian saw the thousands of sword principles slashing towards him and roared. For a moment, the primogenitor Jianwang power was activated to the extreme by Chu Fengmian. Above his head, 7 huge dragon claws suddenly condensed and smashed towards Xian Suntian. It collided with the thousands of sword principles in the air. At the same time, Chu Fengmian was still collecting the unparalleled sword principle. The sword intent of the unparalleled sword principle was being suppressed by Chu Fengmian. At this rate, the unparalleled sword principle would be in Chu Fengmian's hands soon. End of chapter. Chapter 22-24. The 7 gigantic dragon claws came crashing down and forcefully blocked Xian Suntian's sword. Chu Fengmian knew that Xian Suntian and the others would not sit idly by and watch him collect the unparalleled sword art. They would definitely come back to stop him, and he was prepared for that. Ancestor Jianwang's power was condensed, and the moment Xian Suntian rushed into the cave, the 7 enormous dragon claws attacked him at the same time. After neutralizing Xian Suntian's attack, Chu Fengmian focused his attention on suppressing the power of the unparalleled sword art. Most of Chu Fengmian's power was now used to suppress the unparalleled sword art. Although he was only facing Xian Suntian this time, Chu Fengmian was still not easy to deal with. Most of the power of the unparalleled sword art had been suppressed by Chu Fengmian. Now, there was less than 1/10 of its power left, and it was about to be taken away by Chu Fengmian. After the 7 enormous dragon claws neutralized all of Xian Suntian's attacks, they continued to attack Xian Suntian in an attempt to force him out of the cave. At such a critical moment, Chu Fengmian would not allow anyone to cause trouble. The 7 enormous dragon claws were the condensation of ancestor Jianwang's origin in Chu Fengmian's bloodline. When the 7 battle dragon claws were formed, Chu Fengmian felt that the power in his bloodline was almost drained dry. He would not be able to mobilize ancestor Jianwang's power in a short period of time. Chu Fengmian had calculated for a long time and finally had the opportunity to collect the unparalleled sword art. Naturally, he would not let Xian Suntian ruin it. Boom! 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 The power of the dragon claws was almost comparable to the full force attack of a peak immortal general. Even Xian Suntian found it difficult to withstand the attack of the 7 dragon claws. His body was pushed back continuously and he was about to be forced out of the cave. Damn it, this brat is prepared. Xian Suntian knew that Chu Fengmian was prepared when he saw the 7 battle dragon claws. Most of Chu Fengmian's power was now used to suppress the unparalleled sword art. If he wanted to subdue the unparalleled sword art, he had to completely suppress the power of the unparalleled sword art. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. He gathered his spirit energy and summoned the battle dragon's claw. Xian Suntian was immediately forced to retreat. His face was filled with anxiety. He saw that the power of the unparalleled sword art was almost suppressed by Chu Fengmian and was about to be subdued by Chu Fengmian. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the unparalleled sword art, it meant that Chu Fengmian had passed the test and obtained the inheritance of the Shang sword sect. At that time, all of them would die. No, we can't let him succeed. Damn it, I can only use it here. Xian Suntian suddenly looked at the ancient ring on his hand. The unparalleled sword ring had a determined look in his eyes. Suddenly, a surge of sword essence was injected into the ring. As the sword essence was injected into the ring, the unparalleled sword ring surged with a burst of light. It condensed in the air and turned into a sword light that slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The moment the sword light condensed, the unparalleled sword ring in Xian Suntian's hand shattered. This made Xian Suntian's heart ache. The unparalleled sword ring contained the power of the sword light. It was said that the power of the sword light was left behind by the unparalleled sword emperor. The unparalleled sword ring was maintained by this power. Now that this power had been activated, the unparalleled sword ring was shattered. The unparalleled sword ring was related to the unparalleled sword emperor. It could even be used to comprehend the sword principle of the unparalleled sword emperor. It was priceless. Unless it was a last resort, Xian Suntian was unwilling to activate the power of the ring. However, in order to stop Chu Fengmian, he had to do it at all costs. Swoosh! The sword aura was condensed and aimed directly at Chu Fengmian. The speed of the attack was extremely fast. Not good. The moment the sword light condensed, Chu Fengmian, who was trying his best to subdue the unparalleled sword art, couldn't help but be startled. His hair stood on end, and he felt an extremely dangerous aura for a moment. With Chu Fengmian's strength, he would be able to react to any danger he encountered. The feeling of danger was no less than when Chu Fengmian faced the ancient desolate white wolf. He looked over and saw a beam of sword light slashing toward him. The sword light contained a mysterious power that even Chu Fengmian could not see clearly. It was one of the most powerful sword lights since ancient times, and it contained supreme sword power. Damn it! Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with impatience. He knew that the sword light was definitely Xian Suntian's trump card. He had only used it to stop Chu Fengmian from subduing the unparalleled sword qi. Although the sword light contained a powerful power, it was only a sword light after all. It was not impossible for Chu Fengmian to dodge it if he wanted to. However, if Chu Fengmian chose to dodge, he would have to give up subduing the unparalleled sword principle. When the unparalleled sword principle recovered its power, it would be almost impossible for Chu Fengmian to subdue it. There was only one chance to subdue the unparalleled sword principle. I don't believe it. I can't withstand the sword light with my current strength. Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with determination. He would never give up on the unparalleled sword principle. He wanted to take the sword light head-on. At this moment, Chu Fengmian no longer hid his power. He fully unleashed the power of the shocking sword essence, the power of the heaven-devouring beast, and the power of the mysterious whale. Immortal. In an instant, the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body gathered together and turned into a huge formation. A steady stream of power was added to Chu Fengmian's body, causing his power to rise steadily. At the same time, the 7 battle dragon claws also changed. The 7 battle dragon claws were formed by Chu Fengmian's power. Now, with the activation of the immortal secret technique, the power of the 7 battle dragon claws rose crazily. Chu Fengmian's mind moved. The 7 battle dragon claws suddenly swept down and collided with the sword light in the air. Boom! In an instant, the 7 battle dragon claws were all shattered by the sword light. When the sword light slashed out, it seemed that nothing in the world could withstand the sharpness of the sword light. It was unstoppable. Human Emperor's halberd. Chu Fengmian roared. An ancient jar fell into Chu Fengmian's palm. The moment it fell into Chu Fengmian's palm, it suddenly turned into a long halberd. Human Emperor's halberd. End of chapter. Chapter 22-25. Chu Fengmian grabbed the human emperor's halberd and suddenly slammed it toward the incoming sword light. The two forces collided in the air, causing the halberd to tremble violently. Although the sword radiance was only formed by sword essence, the power it contained was still somewhat unbearable for the human emperor's halberd. Cracks began to appear on the halberd of the human emperor. Of course, this was also because the halberd was a broken extreme immoral weapon. There were 9 fragments in total. Although Chu Fengmian had obtained 7 of them, there were still 2 that he hadn't obtained. The condensed halberd of the human emperor was not a complete halberd of the human emperor. If it was the real human emperor's halberd, a complete extreme Dao immoral weapon, even an immoral emperor would have a hard time breaking it. However, the halberd hadn't fully recovered yet. Under the power of the sword light, the newly formed halberd was about to shatter again. Rumble! Just as the halberd was about to give way. Suddenly, the pressure on Chu Fengmian abruptly decreased. An astonishing sword intent erupted from Chu Fengmian's back. The sword intent shrouded Chu Fengmian, causing his strength to soar countless times in an instant. Success! Chu Fengmian was overjoyed. The power of the unparalleled sword technique had been completely suppressed by Chu Fengmian. Originally, most of Chu Fengmian's power was used to suppress the power of the unparalleled sword technique. Now that the unparalleled sword technique was completely suppressed, a part of its power was completely released. In an instant, Chu Fengmian felt that he had relaxed a lot. The pressure he had to withstand from the sword light had also decreased a lot. Chu Fengmian put away the unparalleled sword technique. At the same time, with a flip of his palm, the ancestral dragon supreme sword appeared in his hand. Chu Fengmian held the human emperor's halberd in one hand and the ancestral dragon's paragon sword in the other. The surging sword will that erupted from Chu Fengmian's back all poured into the ancestral dragon's paragon sword as he slashed out. Sky Splitter! All the sword intent erupted with a loud bang as the sword slashed out. The power that could tear everything apart came down with the sword edge and collided with the sword light. Now that Chu Fengmian had used all his strength to execute the Sky Splitter, even if Xian Sungtian and the other 2 joined forces, they wouldn't be able to withstand it, let alone the sword light. The power of the sword radiance had been greatly depleted when it collided with the human emperor's halberd. Now that it was facing the sky-splitting sword, the power of the sword radiance rapidly dissipated and was completely destroyed by the sword. The entire cave shook and began to collapse under the power of the sword light. CT not good. The unparalleled sword technique. Xian Sungtian's face turned ashen when he saw Chu Fengmian block the sword light. He already knew that the unparalleled sword technique had been taken by Chu Fengmian. He wanted to stop Chu Fengmian didn't wish, Xian's. Retreat, retreat. Xian Sungtian didn't want to continue fighting with Chu Fengmian. He immediately turned around and fled outside. Originally, when Chu Fengmian was collecting the unparalleled sword technique, it was the best opportunity for him to kill Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was distracted by the unparalleled sword technique and consumed a lot of energy to suppress the power of the unparalleled sword technique. However, he was still a step too late. Now that the unparalleled sword technique had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands, it was useless for him to continue fighting with Chu Fengmian. Unless he could snatch the unparalleled sword technique from Chu Fengmian's hands. However, even when Chu Fengmian was distracted and consumed energy to suppress the unparalleled sword technique, Xian Sungtian couldn't kill him. Now that Chu Fengmian was going all out, he had no chance. Moreover, what made him feel like a nightmare was that Chu Fengmian had obtained the unparalleled sword technique. This meant that Chu Fengmian had passed the final assessment and obtained the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect. Now, they were in great danger in the Shang Sword sect. Xian Sungtian didn't hesitate and immediately turned to flee. Trying to escape? Xian Sungtian's escape light was fast, but Chu Fengmian's escape light was faster than him. Just as the cave collapsed, Chu Fengmian's escape light flew out rapidly. 2 streaks of light, one after the other, flew out from the cave. In the valley, Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Flying Sword Emperor were still resisting the attack of the ancient Desolation White Wolf. The 2 of them had used all their trump cards and even used secret skills to temporarily increase their power. Now, the 2 of them were barely able to resist the attack of the ancient Desolation White Wolf. However, they were barely able to survive the attack of the ancient Desolation White Wolf. The power of the ancient Desolation White Wolf, an immortal Lord Desolation Beast, was unbelievably strong. While Xian Suntian and Flying Sword Emperor were fighting with the ancient Desolation White Wolf, they were also observing the situation in the cave. Suddenly, their faces changed as they saw the cave collapse. 2 escape lights flew out from the cave. Did you succeed in stopping it? Divinewood Sword Emperor saw Xian Suntian flying out and asked hastily. However, he soon saw Xian Suntian's pale face. Seeing Xian Suntian's expression, he guessed the result. Go, let's go. The Divinewood Sword Emperor did not hesitate either. He immediately unleashed an escape light and fled out of the valley. When he was fighting with the ancient Desolation White Wolf, Divinewood Sword Emperor found an opportunity to break the seal of the life seal above the valley. The seal of the life seal was not something an ordinary sky-human realm expert could break free from. However, when facing a peak immortal lord expert like Divinewood Sword Emperor, it was not that useful. Unless Chu Finmian used his own power to activate it, it would be difficult to resist an expert like Divinewood Sword Emperor with just the power of the life seal. Divinewood Sword Emperor was extremely careful and had already thought of a way out. Seeing that the situation was not good, Divinewood Sword Emperor wanted to escape immediately. Escape? Today, none of the 3 of you will leave. Treat it as a celebration for me obtaining the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. I will bestow your deaths. Suddenly, a cold voice was heard. It was Chu Finmian. Chu Finmian was now standing in the sky above the valley. His face was extremely cold as he looked at Xian Suntian, Divinewood Sword Emperor, and Flying Sword Emperor. The ancient Desolation White Wolf that had been raging suddenly quieted down and waited below. Looking at Chu Finmian's posture, it was extremely respectful. Chu Finmian obtained the unparalleled sword technique, which also meant that Chu Finmian passed the last test of the Upper Sword Sect and became the new sect master of the Upper Sword Sect. Kill them, Chu Finmian said. Suddenly, a huge sword chi slashed down from the sky. End of chapter. Chapter 22-26. The huge sword chi seemed to have descended from the starry sky above the Jade Desolate Star, targeting Xian Suntian and the other 2 and slashing down. Vaguely, a human figure could be seen at the place where the sword chi appeared. The figure was Jianwang. When he looked at Xian Suntian and the other 2, it was as though he was looking at dead people. Among all the sword cultivators who participated in the battle for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect, only one person could obtain the final inheritance and become the sect leader of the Sword Principal Sect. As for the remaining people, they could only die. Jianwang made his move and instantly mobilized the power of the entire Upper Sword Sect ruins. One by one, the great arrays erupted and condensed into a huge sword chi that descended from the sky. The might of this sword chi was unstoppable, and it was simply impossible to resist. In the Upper Sword Sect ruins, Jianwang's strength was comparable to an invincible celestial saint. Even 1,000 Xian Suntian combined would not be able to contend against such strength. No! Xian Suntian shouted in despair as he tried his best to resist the power of the sword chi. However, all his defenses and sword techniques were useless in the face of the huge sword aura. In an instant, Xian Suntian's body was shattered into pieces and turned into a bloody mist. In the blood mist, Xian Suntian's consciousness was completely obliterated. The remaining blood mist could no longer resurrect Xian Suntian. All that was left was pure immortal power. It was the same for the Divinewood Sword Emperor. His body didn't manage to escape either. Under this sword chi, he instantly exploded and turned into a cloud of blood mist. Chu Finmian, my lord, please let me go. I am willing to submit. I am willing to serve you as a slave. The Flying Sword Emperor looked at Xian Suntian and the Divinewood Sword Emperor and looked nervously at Chu Finmian as he begged for mercy. However, Chu Finmian's expression was extremely cold and he did not speak. Then, the sword chi landed on the Flying Sword Emperor's body again. In an instant, the Flying Sword Emperor's body shattered in the sky and only a blood mist was left. All that was left in the sky were clumps of blood mist and the empty ring. With Jianwang's strength, if he were to go all out, Nothing would be left behind from the three of them. Even the spatial zone would be destroyed. However, it was clear that Jian and I purposely left behind their essence blood and spatial rings. Chu Fengmian didn't stand on ceremony either. He immediately activated the sky-devouring secret technique and devoured all the essence and blood of these three people. It turned into a steady stream of immoral power that surged into Chu Fengmian's body. At the same time, Chu Fengmian waved his hand and the three empty rings fell into his hand. Xian, Flying Sword Emperor, Divinewood Sword Emperor, they were almost all invincible experts in the 9 regions, or even the entire extraterritorial starry sky. Hence, they definitely had a lot of treasures on them. Of course, their blood essence was also a great supplement for Chu Fengmian. Now, Chu Fengmian was far from breaking through to the heaven realm. What he lacked was not strength, but the accumulation of power. The power that Chu Fengmian needed to consume if he wanted to step into the heaven realm was almost 10 million times more than an ordinary warrior. Even though Chu Fengmian had devoured a lot of essence blood of wild beasts, his power was still lacking. Now, the essence blood of Xian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divinewood Sword Emperor contained pure immoral power. Through the sky-devouring secret technique, it surged into Chu Fengmian's body continuously. The immoral power that entered Chu Fengmian's body was immediately absorbed by Chu Fengmian's bloodline and the 129,600 immoral power in Chu Fengmian's body. In Chu Fengmian's body, his internal organs, bloodline, and immoral real body started to transform after absorbing a large amount of immoral power. The Divinewood Sword Emperor's immoral power is really strong to the extreme. Among the three people's essence blood, the Divinewood Sword Emperor's essence blood contained immoral power. It was almost equivalent to the immoral power contained in 1,000,000 immoral stones. With such a large amount of immoral power surging into Chu Fengmian's body, the bloodline and immoral crystals in Chu Fengmian's body that were originally thirsting for power started to devour frantically. The continuous influx of immoral power caused Chu Fengmian's power to condense to the extreme. Chu Fengmian stood on top of the valley, his power rising bit by bit. Almost at every moment, Chu Fengmian's power was changing. Jian and I and Ancient Desolation White Wolf stood quietly at the side as if they were guarding Chu Fengmian. They had been watching Chu Fengmian devouring the essence blood of Xian and the other two. The three people's essence blood contained an enormous amount of immoral power. Even though Chu Fengmian had activated the sky-devouring secret technique, it still took him an hour to completely devour the immoral power. Half an hour later, Chu Fengmian's power stopped increasing. His power had completely reached a bottleneck. Vaguely, Chu Fengmian could feel a tribulation cloud gathering above his head. As long as Chu Fengmian was willing, he could summon the Skyman tribulation at any time to break through to the Skyman realm. Half-step Skyman realm limit. Chu Fengmian was overjoyed when he felt the power in his body. He had come to the Shang Sword Sect ruins this time for the inheritance of the Shang Sword Sect. It was an unexpected surprise for Chu Fengmian to obtain such a large amount of essence blood. But it just so happened that the immoral power contained in the essence blood of Xian and the other two made up for Chu Fengmian's previous lack of power, allowing him to break through to the half-step Skyman realm limit. It's really you. You didn't let me down. Jian and I said slowly when he saw Chu Fengmian wake up. There was a hint of emotion in his tone. Jian and I had thought highly of Chu Fengmian since the first stage. Therefore, he deliberately let Chu Fengmian enter another passage and eventually sent Chu Fengmian to a library of the Shang Sword Sect. In that library, Chu Fengmian had also obtained an amazing opportunity. He had collected more than 300 sword techniques and even an immoral emperor sword technique, the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. If he had not entered the library and obtained the opportunity, Chu Fengmian would not have been able to pass the next few stages so smoothly. At least when Chu Fengmian had just entered the Shang Sword Sect ruins, he did not have the strength to contend with the Divinewood Sword Emperor, not to mention being besieged by 3 people. If he had not obtained this opportunity, Chu Fengmian would have died. End of chapter. Chapter 22-27. Thank you for your guidance, Senior. Chu Fengmian looked at Jian and I and said respectfully. For the first level, Jian and I had sent Chu Fengmian into the library. It was indeed a shocking opportunity for Chu Fengmian. Even though he did not obtain the inheritance of the Supreme Sword Sect in the end, Chu Fengmian's harvest from the library was already worth the trip. It can't be considered guidance, and I didn't help you. In the first stage, whichever path you pass through will be considered a successful path. The path I chose for you might contain a great opportunity, but it also contains a great deal of danger. Jian and I said indifferently when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Even you might die in it. Since you can pass this round of assessment, you will naturally obtain the benefits that belong to you. However, I didn't expect you to obtain the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. Jian Ni's tone was filled with surprise. In the ancient era, Jian and I was an invincible figure. His knowledge and experience far surpassed everyone in this era. However, he was still a little surprised when the Yin-Yang Sword Codex was mentioned. Jian and I had sent Chu Fengmian into the library. The real test for Chu Fengmian was the sword spirit formed from the ordinary sword techniques. Apart from the Northern True Sword technique, the other core sword techniques and the Supreme Sword technique, the Yin-Yang Sword Codex, were all hidden in the depths of the library. It could be said that if Chu Fengmian did not take the initiative to approach them, he would not be able to touch those powerful sword spirits. Although this test was extremely difficult, it was not to the point where it was so ridiculous. If one had to defeat the sword spirit of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex, then apart from Chu Fengmian, only Xian Suntian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had a chance. Moreover, they might not succeed. It could be said that the Yin-Yang Sword Codex and the other 5 core sword techniques were not part of the assessment from the beginning. However, after Chu Fengmian entered the library and listened to Xian Suntian's guidance, he took the initiative to search for the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. After a great battle, he subdued the Immortal Emperor Sword technique. The sword spirit formed from the Yin-Yang Sword Codex was known as a pinnacle immortal lord. Even Xian Suntian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not dare to challenge it. Although this action was extremely dangerous, Chu Fengmian had also received the reward that belonged to him. The greater the danger, the greater the reward. This was the case for the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance test. The fact that Chu Fengmian was able to kill the sword spirit of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex and obtain it was indeed out of Chu Fengmian's expectations. I am not surprised that you were able to obtain the final inheritance. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect can be handed over to you. To me, the thousands of years of waiting have not been in vain. Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian and muttered to himself. There was a gratified look in his eyes, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Chu Fengmian didn't find this strange. Jian and I could be considered the only living person in the entire Upper Sword Sect. However, he wasn't a living person. He had used some sort of method to survive. The only thing Jian and I had to do in these thousands of years was to find a suitable successor and continue the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. This matter seemed simple, but in reality, it was incomparably heavy. If the wrong successor was chosen, the most ancient sword Dao inheritance would be completely destroyed. As for Chu Fengmian, Jian and I was extremely satisfied no matter how he looked at it. Even in the ancient era where experts were as common as clouds, Chu Fengmian's performance was worthy of obtaining the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect and becoming the new sect master of the Upper Sword Sect. From now on, you will be the 172nd sect master of the Upper Sword Sect. Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian and finally revealed a smile. He waved his hand and a crown suddenly appeared in his palm. It was unknown what metal was used to cast the crown. It was incomparably majestic and made people feel respect. This is the Sword Emperor crown? Chu Fengmian suddenly recognized the origin of this crown when he saw it. The Sword Emperor crown. It was a crown that represented the position of the Upper Sword Sect Master. The person who obtained the Sword Emperor crown would be the new Sword Emperor of the 9 regions. Since ancient times, there were countless existences that were called Sword Emperors, such as the Flying Sword Emperor and the Unparalleled Sword Emperor. As long as they could step into the Sky Realm, they were qualified to be called Sword Emperors. However, if it was just the two words Sword Emperor, there were only a total of over 100 people with the title of Sword Emperor. Only the sect master of the Upper Sword sect was qualified to be called Sword Emperor. Although it was only two words, no one had called themselves Sword Emperor since ancient times. At most, they would call themselves Flying Sword Emperor. The two words Sword Emperor represented the Upper Sword sect in an era of Sword Dao. This Sword Emperor crown now belongs to you. I hope you will not disgrace the name of Sword Emperor in the future. Jianwang slowly spoke and handed the Sword Emperor crown to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian nodded and took the Sword Emperor crown and put it on his head. Suddenly, the Sword Emperor crown emitted a dazzling radiance. The radiance enveloped Chu Fengmian's body. In an instant, countless memories poured into Chu Fengmian's mind. Those memories were the inherited memories of the Upper Sword sect. The moment someone put on the Sword Emperor crown, those memories would belong to that person. Those memories had a history of hundreds of thousands of years. All of a sudden, they poured into Chu Fengmian's mind. Even Chu Fengmian felt that he was about to explode. At the same time, Chu Fengmian's body began to change slowly under this ray of light. Little by little, an aura that could swallow mountains and rivers and control the sea appeared on Chu Fengmian's body. A total of 6 hours passed. Chu Fengmian stood there without moving. The Sword Emperor crown was perfectly fitted on Chu Fengmian's head. His mind was still accepting the memories contained within the Sword Emperor crown. Those memories were ancient and there were some secrets that were recorded in the Upper Sword sect. There were also many mysteries and sword arts left behind by the sect masters of the Upper Sword sect. The prosperity of the Upper Sword sect was close to 1,000,000 years ago. The number of memories contained within the Sword Emperor crown was astronomical. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian was strong enough. If it was an ordinary Emperor realm cultivator or demon god, it would probably take tens of thousands of years just to accept those memories. Even some heaven realm cultivators would need hundreds of years to completely accept them. Therefore, in the Upper Sword sect's inheritance test, the weakest had to be an immortal general. Otherwise, just the inheritance of memories would be troublesome. End of chapter. Chapter 22-28. Even for Chu Fengmian, it took a total of 6 hours to accept all the memories contained in the Sword Emperor crown into his mind. Although Chu Fengmian slowly opened his eyes, there was still some confusion in his eyes. However, there were too many memories in his mind. It wouldn't take a day or two to look through all the memories. Although Chu Fengmian accepted the memories, some of them flashed past in a hurry. You can slowly look through the memories in the Sword Emperor crown in the future. Looking at Chu Fengmian's confused expression, Jianwang said with a smile. Follow me, I'll take you to a place. After Chu Fengmian obtained the inheritance and became the new sect master of the Shang Sword sect, the Sword Emperor, Jianwang's attitude towards Chu Fengmian became much gentler. As he spoke, he opened a spatial tunnel. Chu Fengmian didn't hesitate and followed Jianwang into the spatial tunnel. Behind the spatial tunnel was a huge palace. At a glance, there were thousands of seats on both sides of the palace. In the center of the palace, there was a huge throne. Even though there was no one sitting on the throne, it still brought about a huge pressure. The moment anyone saw the throne, their hearts would be filled with incomparable respect. This is the main hall of the Shang Sword sect. Jianwang came to the palace and looked at the empty palace. His eyes were filled with nostalgia. From the main hall, one could tell how powerful the Shang Sword sect was in the past. However, everything had turned into bubbles. In the palace, there were only Jianwang and Chu Fengmian. It seemed extremely empty and desolate. There were restrictions and arrays everywhere in the palace. It could be said that if one were to take a wrong step, they would fall into an irrecoverable situation. It was extremely dangerous. Anyone who came to the palace would feel that it was extremely dangerous. But now, Chu Fengmian didn't feel the slightest bit of danger. Instead, he felt at ease when he came to the palace. After the Sword Emperor crown recognized its owner, Chu Fengmian suddenly felt at ease. Now, Chu Fengmian felt that the surrounding restrictions and arrays in the Shang Sword Sect's ruins were no longer a threat. Instead, there was an incomparably familiar feeling. Chu Fengmian looked at the restriction in front of him. Suddenly, his mind moved. He tried to control the restriction, and it actually fell under his control. However, Chu Fengmian was currently unfamiliar with the power of a restriction. Although he could control it, he was unable to activate its power. After several attempts, Chu Fengmian was able to control any restriction formation in the hall. However, if Chu Fengmian wanted to activate the power of these formations, he would have to control them and comprehend their mysteries. The Sword Monarch Crown has already recognized you as its master. Now, you are the master of this High Sword Sect. Everything here belongs to you. As long as you comprehend the mysteries within these formations from your memories, you will be able to control them. Seeing Chu Fengmian's actions, Jian and I didn't stop him and only smiled. Everything about the Upper Sword Sect can be found in the memories left behind by the Sword Emperor Crown. You can slowly comprehend it later. I don't have much time left. I only need to instruct you on a few things. Chu Fengmian's expression was incomparably serious as he listened to Jian and I in silence. He also knew that Jian and I wasn't a living person. For him to exist for millions of years, he must have used some means. However, it was impossible for such means to be immortal. Jian and I waited for millions of years in order to preserve the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect and select the next sect master. Now that his mission was completed, Jian Ni's life was about to come to an end. Firstly, you've now obtained the inheritance of the Shang Sword Sect. All the sword skills and secret skills of the Shang Sword Sect belong to you. You can pass these secret skills and sword skills to others, even if you're not a disciple of the Shang Sword Sect. However, only the unparalleled sword skill is the foundation of the Shang Sword Sect. It's also the blood and sweat of the first sect master of the Shang Sword Sect, the unparalleled Sword Emperor. Only those who pass the Shang Sword Sect's assessment are qualified to learn the unparalleled sword skill. Even if you are the sect master, you cannot impart it to others. This is the iron law of the Upper Sword Sect. Yes. Chu Fengmian nodded upon hearing this. Now that he had inherited the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect, he naturally had to abide by the rules of the Upper Sword Sect. Secondly, when you become strong in the future, you have to kill a person for the Upper Sword Sect. This person's name is Nether. This person is the greatest enemy of the Upper Sword Sect. If you can kill him, we won't have any regrets even if we die. Jian Ni's tone was filled with boundless killing intent when he mentioned you. Just by mentioning a name, Jian and I was unable to restrain his anger. Nether? This name is only one word? Chu Fengmian asked curiously. It was the first time Chu Fengmian had seen a name with only one word. However, it's only one word. However, you have to be careful. Nether's strength is unfathomable. The destruction of the Upper Sword Sect is all because of him. Jian and I nodded and replied. The destruction of the Upper Sword Sect is all because of him? Chu Fengmian was shocked when he heard this. The prosperity of the Upper Sword Sect was recorded in various ancient books. Now that Chu Fengmian had come to the ruins of the Upper Sword Sect, Chu Fengmian could imagine the prosperity of the Upper Sword Sect from the ruins. Moreover, it was different from many sects that had been annihilated in history. The Upper Sword Sect didn't decline and perish, but it suddenly encountered a calamity and was destroyed. In various ancient books, it was called a great calamity. However, there was no record of what this great calamity was. Now that he heard Jian Ni's words, it seemed that the destruction of the Upper Sword Sect and the great calamity was all because of this person called Nether. In the history of the Upper Sword Sect, there was more than one immortal emperor and countless immortal saints and immortal venerables. However, with so many experts, they were all destroyed because of one person. The Upper Sword Sect is powerful. How could a traitor destroy the Upper Sword Sect? It's because Jian Ni's words came to an abrupt halt when he saw a sword light appearing on Chu Fengmian's body. The sword light suddenly emerged from Chu Fengmian's glabella and disappeared in an instant. However, Jian and I saw it and his following words came to an abrupt halt. End of chapter. Chapter 22-29. What's wrong? When Chu Fengmian saw that Jian and I had suddenly stopped speaking, he asked with some doubt. It's nothing. You will know the reason for the destruction of the Shang Sword sect in the future. Jian and I kept him in suspense and then changed the topic. You only need to do these two things. In your memory, there are various treasures left behind by the Shang Sword sect and the situation of the ruins. The ruins of the Shang Sword sect are hidden in the depths of the void. If you want to return, you can return at any time. That nether is still alive? Just as Jian and I finished speaking, Chu Fengmian suddenly asked the question in his heart. According to Jian and I, the expert named Nether was related to the destruction of the Shang Sword sect. However, the destruction of the Shang Sword sect happened millions of years ago. A person could live for millions of years? Chu Fengmian couldn't imagine it. In ancient books, ancient immortal emperors and even invincible sovereigns couldn't withstand the passage of time and fell one after another. Chu Fengmian simply couldn't imagine that a person could live for millions of years. Even some demonic beast clans with noble bloodlines, such as the invincible experts of the ancient War Dragon clan, could only live for millions of years at most. Millions of years. Chu Fengmian couldn't imagine how a person could live for so long. But after hearing Jian Ni's words, Jian and I was certain that mystery was still alive and wanted Chu Fengmian to kill him. He must still be alive. Rather than saying he's a human, it's better to say he's an anomaly now. An anomaly that doesn't belong to any race. Jian and I said. When you go to the Tianjiu regions, you will know about Nether. As Jian and I spoke, his figure became illusory. It was as if the figure that had been maintained for millions of years was about to shatter. My time is up. The Shang Sword sect will depend on you next. To be recognized by Lord Xingxian as your master, your future might surpass everyone. Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian and suddenly spoke. Lord Xingxian? Chu Fengmian was stunned when he heard the title. He didn't expect Jian and I to know about Xingxian's existence and address him as Lord. Chu Fengmian didn't know Jian Ni's true identity. However, for him to be able to live for tens of millions of years and be in charge of selecting a successor for the Shang Sword sect, it was likely that he was an extremely high existence in the Shang Sword sect when he was alive. He just didn't expect that this existence from millions of years ago would actually know about Xingxian, and even seem to be very familiar with it. Didn't Lord Xingxian tell you his identity? Jian and I said slowly when he saw Chu Fengmian's shocked expression. Since Lord Xingxuan didn't take the initiative to tell me, then I won't talk too much. Remember, you must be careful of the 7 great sections. After Jian and I finished speaking, his figure suddenly shattered and dissipated. In this huge palace, only Chu Fengmian was left standing there in a daze. Xingxuan, who exactly are you? Chu Fengmian was silent for a while and suddenly said. Originally, Chu Fengmian only thought that Xianxing was a sword spirit. However, based on Xianxing's knowledge in sword and verses words, Chu Fengmian was certain that Xianxing's identity wasn't that simple. I am just a sword spirit, an ancient sword spirit. In order to survive, I am a sword spirit. Xingxian said with an indifferent voice. When you go to Tianjiu domain and pass the test, you will know my past when you can truly control the blood-slaughtering demon sword. After Xingxian finished speaking, his voice came to an abrupt stop. No matter how Chu Fengmian called out, he didn't make a sound. Pass the test? Soon. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. The trip to the Upper Sword Sect ruins was Chu Fengmian's preparation for heading to Tianjiu domain. His next step was to head to Tianjiu domain. The method to control the Upper Sword Sect ruins. In Chu Fengmian's mind, he suddenly flipped through the memories obtained from the Sword Emperor crown. Right now, Chu Fengmian was the only living person in the palace. Jian and I had already disappeared. If Chu Fengmian wanted to leave the Upper Sword Sect ruins, he could only rely on himself. There were many memories in the Sword Emperor crown, but they were classified very carefully. Chu Fengmian quickly found the method to control the Upper Sword Sect. Unlike other sects, where there were supreme elders and other existences to control the sect master of the Upper Sword sect was the existence that controlled the power of the Upper Sword sect. He had supreme majesty and no one could interfere. In the entire Upper Sword sect, all the restrictions and formations could only be controlled by the sect master, unless they were taught by the sect master. There were countless restrictions and formations left in the Upper Sword sect. Almost every generation of the Upper Sword sect master would leave some restrictions and formations to protect the Upper Sword sect. Many of these restrictions and formations were set up by invincible immortal emperors. They were connected to form a great formation that could withstand the erosion of time. Even after tens of millions of years, such terrifying power was still preserved. However, the power of the restrictions and formations in the Upper Sword sect was still much weaker than when it was at its peak. It was less than 1/10. Tens of millions of years could turn the sea into mulberry fields and destroy tens of thousands of stars. In the past, the Upper Sword sect could contend against an immortal emperor just by relying on the restrictions and formations. Now, the full strength of the Upper Sword sect could contend against an immortal saint. But for Chu Fengmian, it was already very fortunate. With these restrictions and formations in the Upper Sword sect, Chu Fengmian was not worried that someone would rashly break into the Upper Sword sect. After all, Chu Fengmian was now in control of the Upper Sword sect. The ruins of the Upper Sword sect had also become another base for Chu Fengmian. Moreover, compared to the Origin Sword world, the restrictions and formations left behind here were even more powerful. However, Chu Fengmian had already decided to hide the Upper Sword sect and the entire sword domain. Although there were tens of thousands of restrictions left behind in the Upper Sword sect, the power of these restrictions was ultimately limited. Once the 7 major sects discovered the Upper Sword sect's location, they would most likely attack at all costs. Chu Fengmian could not calculate the hidden strength of the 7 major sections. The Upper Sword sect had been hiding in the depths of the void all this time with the intention of hiding from others. Although the Upper Sword sect had been destroyed, the library and treasure trove that it had left behind were still extremely attractive. Therefore, Chu Fengmian did not plan to move the Upper Sword sect into the sword domain. Instead, he wanted to hide here and make it his base. Unless there was no other choice, he would only hide here. This sword domain is really incomparably huge. Chu Fengmian read through the memories of the Upper Sword sect and the records of the entire sword domain. He was extremely emotional. The Upper Sword sect was divided into 2 major parts, the Outer Sword domain and the Upper Sword domain. These 2 small worlds were collectively known as the Sword domain. End of chapter. Chapter 2230. It should be said that this was actually a small world. It was just that the Outer Sword domain had been taken away and formed its own region. It was once a buffer zone for the Upper Sword sect. The Outer Sect disciples of the Upper Sword sect, the martial artists and demon immortals who wanted to be apprenticed to the Upper Sword sect, and the martial artists and demon immortals who were inextricably linked to the Upper Sword sect, all lived in cities in the Outer Sword domain. The Upper Sword City was the largest city in the Outer Sword domain. These martial artists and demon immortals, as well as the outer disciples of the Upper Sword sect, were only qualified to enter the real Upper Sword domain after becoming an inner disciple of the Upper Sword sect. The main hall that Chu Fengmian was in was located in the Upper Sword domain, where the real Upper Sword sect was located. All the treasures and cultivation places of the Upper Sword sect were in the Upper Sword sect. The Upper Sword sect was once a sect that dominated the 9 regions, with countless disciples. Just the inner disciples alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands. This number might not seem like much, but according to his memory, those who could become an inner disciple of the Upper Sword sect were at least half-step celestial realm martial artists and demon immortals. Most of them were experts who had stepped into the celestial realm. Having hundreds of thousands of celestial realm experts, this number was terrifying just thinking about it. Due to the upheaval in the 9 regions, the 9 regions had attracted countless experts from all over the extraterritorial starry sky. Even so, Chu Fengmian had only seen a few hundred celestial realm experts. Hundreds of thousands of celestial realm experts, this number terrified Chu Fengmian. Of course, in addition to the inner disciples, there was also a group of unique existences in the upper sword domain. They were the sword slaves. There were many sword slaves in the upper sword sect, all of whom were former enemies of the upper sword sect. After being captured by the experts of the upper sword sect, they were demoted to servants to serve the upper sword sect. These sword slaves were branded with the upper sword sect's brand. It could be said that if they had any disloyalty, they would be killed by the power of the upper sword sect. They could only be extremely loyal and serve the upper sword sect. It was precisely because of this that these sword servants were able to learn the profound sword techniques of the sword sect when compared to ordinary inner court disciples, and the strengths of some sword servants were even more formidable than some elders of the sword sect. Some warriors and fey gods admitted that they were unable to become disciples of the upper sword sect, but there were also those who chose to become sword slaves. When the high sword sect was flourishing, merely the number of sword servants was in the hundreds of thousands, and it was almost on par with the number of inner court disciples in the high sword sect. The combined strength of these sword servants was equivalent to less than half of the high sword sect's strength. During that era, the sword servant army of the sword sect was an existence that struck terror in the hearts of others. At that time, countless sects in the 9 regions had been trampled by the sword slave army of the supreme sword sect. To be able to house so many disciples and sword slaves in the upper sword domain, the upper sword domain must be even larger than the outer sword domain, to the point where one couldn't see the end of it. The upper sword domain was no longer a pocket world, but a real world. It was even bigger than several star domains in the extraterritorial starry sky combined. Chu Fengmian left the hall and looked outside. Numerous palaces stood in the upper sword domain. However, many of the palaces were now in ruins. In the battle that destroyed the upper sword sect, many of the palaces and sacred grounds in the sect were in ruins. They no longer existed. Chu Fengmian looked around and felt that it was a pity. These palaces and holy lands had been built by countless experts of the upper sword sect at great cost. However, most of them had been reduced to ruins in the destructive battle. Only a few of them were left intact. This palace was the core of the upper sword domain, and it was reinforced with countless restrictions and formations. That was why it was able to survive the destructive battle and remain in good condition. As for what was left, there were not many of them. Chu Fengmian left the hall and flew around the upper sword sect. In his mind, he had gone through many memories of the upper sword sect. He already knew the purpose and origin of each of the palaces in the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian flew all the way until he arrived in front of a ruin. This ruin seemed to have once been a huge palace. The palace was so big that it was not inferior to the main hall of the upper sword sect. Even looking at the remains of the dilapidated walls, one could see the glory of this palace in the past. However, what was left now was just a pile of ruins. Chu Fengmian looked at the palace below. Suddenly, he descended and took out a huge wooden tablet from the ruins. This wooden tablet was carved from an unknown divine wood. The entire palace was destroyed, but this wooden tablet was not damaged at all. On the wooden tablet, there was a huge word pill. The pill hall is also destroyed. Chu Fengmian looked at the wooden tablet and muttered to himself. This palace was the pill hall of the upper sword sect. It was the place where countless experts of the upper sword sect refined their pills. The saint pills produced here were enough to supply the entire upper sword sect. It was one of the most prosperous areas of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian came over to see if the pill hall was still there. He wanted to find some pills from it. The pill hall of the upper sword sect was the best alchemist sect in that era. It was even able to refine immortal pills. If he could find a few immortal pills, it would greatly increase Chu Fengmian's strength. But now, the entire pill hall had become a pile of ruins. This made Chu Fengmian's eyes flash with disappointment. The pill hall had become a pile of ruins. The pills inside were nowhere to be found. I wonder if the pill recipes recorded were destroyed. Chu Fengmian looked at the wooden tablet and suddenly injected his spiritual consciousness into it. This wooden tablet seemed ordinary, but as Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness approached it, a dazzling light suddenly burst out from it. The wooden patterns actually turned into the shape of a formation. The entire wooden tablet turned into a huge formation. This wooden tablet was left behind from the battle of destruction. Naturally, it was not an ordinary item. The wood of this wooden tablet was one of the heaven and earth divine wood, the divine spiritual wood. It could contain a huge amount of immortal power. It was a good material to carve a formation. However, the moment this large array appeared, it seemed to have sensed Chu Fengmian's aura. The power of this array disappeared without a trace all of a sudden. Chu Fengmian knew that this huge formation had recognized Chu Fengmian's power. Now that Chu Fengmian had obtained the Sword Emperor crown, Chu Fengmian's power carried the aura of the Upper Sword sect. This formation naturally would not go against Chu Fengmian after sensing this aura. End of chapter. Chapter 2231. The power on the wooden tablet gradually dissipated, revealing its original appearance. Golden words appeared on the wooden tablet. Only one's spiritual sense could read the contents of these words. Chu Fengmian activated his spiritual consciousness and enveloped it. Suddenly, the contents of these golden words appeared in Chu Fengmian's mind. Pill recipes. These golden words recorded pill recipes. They were all pill recipes that were controlled by the pill hall of the Shang Sword sect. Although the Shang Sword sect was famous for its sword Dao, not all of its disciples were sword cultivators. There were alchemists who cultivated the Dao of alchemy, blacksmiths who cultivated the Dao of blacksmiths, and even array masters who cultivated the Dao of heavenly divination. There were many of them. There were many famous alchemists in the pill hall. There were also many pill recipes that were recorded. These pill recipes were all engraved on the tablet of the pill hall. Even the disciples of the pill hall did not know about this secret. In the entire Shang Sword sect, only the sect master knew about it. Chu Fengmian only knew about this secret when he obtained the Sword Emperor crown and became the new sect master of the Shang Sword sect. Although the pill hall was destroyed, the tablet of the pill hall was still there. The pill recipes recorded should still be there. The value of these pill recipes was priceless. Chu Fengmian could not help but be shocked when he saw the pill recipes of many saint elixirs. Many of the pill recipes here were lost in the 9 regions for millions of years. The 9 regions had experienced more than one war. Every time there was a change of sect, it would cause a war in the entire 9 regions. In the battles, many pill recipes, martial skills, sword arts, martial arts, etc., would be lost, resulting in them being completely lost. Chu Fengmian had never seen more than half of the pill recipes on the tablet. One should know that in Chu Fengmian's previous life, other than comprehending sword techniques, what he did the most was alchemy and blacksmithing. His attainments in alchemy and blacksmithing were not inferior to those alchemists and blacksmiths. Even so, many of the pill recipes here were things that Chu Fengmian had never seen before. It could be said that they were lost in the 9 regions. These pill recipes would be extremely expensive if taken out. Countless sects would fight for them. In addition to these sage elixirs, there were also some immortal elixir recipes recorded on the signboard. In the 9 regions, immortal elixirs were something that people had only heard of but never seen. In his previous life, Chu Fengmian had never seen an immortal elixir before. In this life, Chu Fengmian had only seen an immortal elixir during a trade with the Sky-Reaching Pavilion. It could be said that many immortal generals might not even see an immortal pill in their entire lives. What's more, it was an immortal pill recipe. With Chu Fengmian's current strength, it wasn't impossible for him to concoct immortal pills. However, he didn't have the pill recipe. Even if he had the immortal herbs, he wouldn't be able to concoct them without the pill recipe. There were more than 10 types of elixir recipes recorded on the plaque. Chu Fengmian had never seen any of them before. Even if Chu Fengmian didn't need these pill formulas, he could still sell them for a sky-high price. A single pill formula could be used to buy dozens, or even hundreds of immoral pills. Although I don't have any immoral elixirs, it's not bad to get these pill formulas. Chu Fengmian came to the pill palace to look for some immoral elixirs. Now that he didn't find any immoral elixirs, Chu Fengmian was satisfied with these pill formulas. Chu Fengmian kept the signboard into his spatial ring. Then, he activated his flying light again and headed to the next place. The next place that Chu Fengmian went to was the Tool Palace, which corresponded to the Pill Palace. This was the place where the disciples of the Upper Sword sect refined their weapons. The number of immoral tools produced here was uncountable. However, compared to the Pill Palace, the Tool Palace was destroyed to a greater extent. The entire Tool Palace was razed to the ground. Chu Fengmian couldn't find anything useful from it. After searching for a while, Chu Fengmian turned into a flying light again and flew to the next place. Chu Fengmian was already prepared for such a scene. After all, the Upper Sword sect didn't decline slowly. It was destroyed because of a sudden battle. There shouldn't be many treasures left. However, even if there was only 1% or 1,000th of the treasures left, it would still be very useful to Chu Fengmian if he could get it. The next place that Chu Fengmian went to was a sacred place, the Sword River. This was a river, not a place like a palace. Hence, it wasn't destroyed and was still intact. This Sword River was the sacred place of the Upper Sword sect. It was the place where countless disciples of the Upper Sword sect cultivated. Only the outstanding disciples of the Upper Sword sect were qualified to enter the Sword River to cultivate. Chu Fengmian looked at the Sword River below him from the sky. Then, he slowly descended and stepped into the Sword River. The water in the Sword River was very turbulent. However, such a river wasn't a threat to warriors. The inner disciples of the Upper Sword sect had the power to move mountains and fill seas. The turbulent river was nothing to them. However, the moment Chu Fengmian stepped into the Sword River, he suddenly felt that the sword intent from all directions rushed towards Chu Fengmian. These sword intents were all hidden in the Sword River's water. In fact, the water in the Sword River wasn't water. Instead, it was condensed from powerful sword intents. The entire Sword River was formed from the sword intents left behind by countless sword experts. Once someone entered it, they would be washed by thousands of sword intents. For the disciples of the Upper Sword sect, being able to enter the Sword River and be washed by thousands of sword intents would bring great benefits as long as they persevered for a period of time. It could further improve their sword principles. Chu Fengmian also stayed in the Sword River for a few minutes before he slowly walked out. His clothes were not soaked at all. After all, the water of the Sword River wasn't real water. It was sword intents. Naturally, it wouldn't soak his clothes. The Sword River could be said to be a holy land created by countless sword cultivators throughout the generations of the Shang Sword sect. It was extremely beneficial for sword cultivators as they could condense sword essence and improve their swordsmanship. However, for Chu Fengmian, the Sword River was useless. In terms of sword principles, Chu Fengmian's sword principles had even surpassed the Immortal Emperor's sword principles. He was taking the last step towards the origin of sword principles. In Chu Fengmian's eyes, the sword intents in the Sword River were like child's play. They couldn't affect Chu Fengmian at all. It was useless for Chu Fengmian to cultivate in it. However, Chu Fengmian was probably the only sword cultivator in the world. For most sword cultivators, even immortal monarchs and immortal saints, the Sword River was also very useful. Chu Fengmian could send some outstanding disciples of the Sword sect to cultivate in the Sword River. End of chapter. Chapter 2232. Chu Fengmian left the Sword River and continued to fly towards the depths of the Shang Sword sect. The Sword River was not the only cultivation holy land in the Shang Sword sect. There were hundreds of such cultivation holy lands. These cultivation holy lands were also one of the foundations of the Shang Sword sect's longevity. Although many of these cultivation holy lands had been destroyed in the War of Destruction, there were still dozens of them left. Chu Fengmian went to a few holy lands for cultivation and gave it a try. He couldn't help but show some disappointment in his eyes. These cultivation holy lands were of no use to Chu Fengmian's sword principle. Chu Fengmian's sword principle comprehension had surpassed many immortal emperors. If he went one step further, he would be able to reach the unreachable sword principle origin. These external methods were of no use to Chu Fengmian's sword principle. There were only two ways for Chu Fengmian to improve his sword principle. The first was to study and comprehend a lot of sword principles. The second was to collect the sword Dao totems and comprehend the incomplete sword art in the sword Dao totem. Sword principle totems were almost impossible to find. Chu Fengmian knew that almost all the sword principle totems that still existed were in the hands of the Tianjian sect. However, Chu Fengmian couldn't attack the Tianjian sect now. The Tianjian sect's foundation was unfathomable, and it was related to the Tianjiu domain. If it was just the Tianjian sect, Chu Fengmian would have a chance to attack the Tianjian sect with his current strength. However, Chu Fengmian was worried about the Tianjiu domain behind the Tianjian sect. The Tianjiu domain was the rumored leader of the sacred realms. If the experts of the Tianjiu domain came, Chu Fengmian's strength would be nothing. If this method didn't work, Chu Fengmian could only choose the first method. He would find a lot of sword principles to comprehend, integrate them into ancient sword principle books, and create his 9-domain sword principle. It just so happened that there was no lack of sword principles in the Shang sword sect. There were thousands of sword principles in the Shang sword sect. Chu Fengmian had only entered a library of the High Sword sect. There were as many as 12 such libraries in the High Sword sect. These libraries were all hidden in the depths of the Upper Sword sect's space. Even the majority of the Upper Sword sect's disciples didn't know where the libraries were located. They could only enter through certain formations. However, now that Chu Fengmian had obtained the memories of the Sword Emperor crown, the entire Upper Sword sect was like Chu Fengmian's home. With a flick of his mind, the space in front of him suddenly shattered. He slowly walked in, and in an instant, he stepped into a library. Chu Fengmian glanced around and found that there were no more ancient swordsmanship books on the bookshelves in the library. After thousands of years, these swordsmanship had already given birth to sword spirits. Chu Fengmian already knew this when he entered the book pavilion. The sword spirits born from these swordsmanship were a good thing for Chu Fengmian. It could be said that those sword spirits understood those swordsmanship the best. When fighting with those sword spirits, Chu Fengmian could also understand the mysteries of those swordsmanship more clearly. However, after Chu Fengmian carefully searched the surroundings, his brows furrowed. He felt that the entire library was empty. There was no trace of the sword spirit at all. Chu Fengmian's figure flickered again and again as he walked through the library. Finally, he saw a crack in the space above the library. This crack led to the outside of the sword domain. It actually broke the seal of the library. Chu Fengmian could see that the formation used to seal these sword spirits in the library had been broken. Obviously, it was impossible for these sword spirits to break it. It should be the aftermath of the destructive battle, which created a gap in the array formation of the library. After thousands of years, the sword spirits born from these swordsmanship escaped through the gap. As a result, the library was now empty. What a pity! Chu Fengmian whispered to himself. There were more than 300 swordsmanship in such a library. If Chu Fengmian could get them, it would greatly improve his ancient swordsmanship books. But now, all of them had escaped. Chu Fengmian sighed. He broke the space again and went to the next library. This book collection pavilion was different from the previous one. The restriction covering it was intact. The moment Chu Fengmian stepped into it, dozens of sword lights suddenly slashed toward Chu Fengmian from all directions. The moment the swordsmanship in the library sensed Chu Fengmian's aura, they immediately attacked and slashed toward Chu Fengmian. Sword out! Chu Fengmian's mind moved. The ancestral dragon supreme sword appeared in his hand and he suddenly slashed out. In an instant, the dazzling sword edge swept across everything. The sword lights that were slashing toward Chu Fengmian were shattered by the sword edge and turned back to their original forms. Chu Fengmian reached out his hand and the swordsmanship books fell into his palm. Chu Fengmian looked at the depths of the library and saw the flying sword lights. He immediately moved his feet and rushed over. For a moment, the library was filled with sword lights. The sword spirits were killed by Chu Fengmian and returned to their original forms. The swordsmanship books fell into Chu Fengmian's hands. Die! In less than 5 minutes, the last sword spirit in the library was killed by Chu Fengmian. When the sword spirit was destroyed, a sword essence condensed into an ancient book in front of him. The words amethyst were written on it. The 2 words purple crystal exuded a shocking sword essence. Some weaker warriors would be injured by the sword essence if they got close to it. The amethyst swordsmanship, one of the 12 supreme swordsmanship. Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient swordsmanship book in front of him and whispered to himself. There were a total of 12 libraries in the upper sword sect. In each library, there was a supreme swordsmanship, 12 core swordsmanship, and 300 ordinary swordsmanship. The one in the library was the amethyst swordsmanship. The amethyst swordsmanship was created by the amethyst venerable. Although the amethyst venerable was not an immortal emperor, the amethyst swordsmanship that he created was not inferior to the yin-yang sword codex. To Chu Fengmian, the amethyst swordsmanship was even more important than the yin-yang sword codex. The amethyst venerable was not a human. He was an expert of a unique race, the amethyst stoneman race. End of chapter. Chapter 2233. During the primordial era, there were hundreds of races. There were far more races than there are now. The so-called 100 races were the names of the 100 great races. Humans were also part of the 100 races back then. Other than the 100 races, there were also countless smaller races. There were thousands of them. The Purple Crystal Stone Man race was one of them. It was a unique race. The Purple Crystal Stone Man race was a living creature born from a unique stone, the Purple Crystal Caltrop. The spiritual energy during the primordial era was far richer than it is now. The air was filled with chaotic energy. Hence, there were far more races born. Purple crystal caltrops were not impossible to find in the current era. However, it was difficult to give birth to purple crystal stone men. During the Great Primordial Calamity, the 100 races were almost wiped out, not to mention the smaller races. Among the thousands of races in the primordial era, less than 1% of them survived. Now, the humans, sea tribes, barbarians, and the others could be considered as the lucky ones. As for the purple crystal humanoid race, their number was extremely small to begin with. As such, very few of them were able to survive. The purple crystal immortal exalted was one of them. He had managed to survive the Great Primordial Calamity and join the Upper Sword sect. He created the Purple Crystal Sword Principle with his unique understanding of the Purple Crystal Stone Man race. It could be said that the Purple Crystal Sword Principle was different from all the other sword principles in the world. It contained the mysteries of the Purple Crystal Stone Man race. Hence, even though the Purple Crystal Sword Principle was not an immortal Emperor Sword Principle, it was more precious and important to Chu Fengmian than the Yin-Yang Sword Principle. Among the 12 Supreme Sword Principles of the Supreme Sword Sect, only the Amethyst Sword Principle was an exception. The other 11 sword principles were created by human ancient martial art practitioners. Chu Fengmian wanted to integrate all the sword principles in the world into the ancient swordsmanship book. Sword principles of foreign races like the Purple Crystal Immortal Technique were very important to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian found a place to sit in the library. He took out all the sword principles that he had obtained from killing the sword spirit and began to comprehend them one by one. The library had the strictest security of the High Sword sect. It was very safe to cultivate in the library. Since there was a chance, Chu Fengmian was ready to comprehend all the sword principles. Chu Fengmian flipped through the swordsmanship books one after another. Chu Fengmian's sword will envelop the books and immediately comprehended the mysteries within. Above Chu Fengmian's head, the ancient swordsmanship book also condensed. Brand new pages began to condense one after another. As Chu Fengmian comprehended more and more sword skills, his speed of comprehending sword skills also increased. Although there were tens of millions of sword techniques in the world, many of them had something in common. The more sword techniques Chu Fengmian comprehended, the more he could discover the mysteries of sword techniques. Chu Fengmian had already comprehended them. As a result, the speed at which Chu Fengmian comprehended the swordsmanship became extremely fast. In a few breaths, Chu Fengmian could comprehend the mysteries of some swordsmanship and integrate them into the ancient swordsmanship books. However, although the speed was fast, it didn't benefit Chu Fengmian much. After all, comprehending the same mysterious swordsmanship didn't improve Chu Fengmian's ancient swordsmanship book by much. Only those extremely special and independent swordsmanship would be of great help to Chu Fengmian. 300 ordinary sword techniques and 6 core sword techniques were easily comprehended. In front of Chu Fengmian, there was only the amethyst swordsmanship left. The amethyst swordsmanship was also the swordsmanship that Chu Fengmian valued the most. Chu Fengmian's face was extremely serious. A burst of sword will burst out and immediately shrouded the amethyst swordsmanship. One after another, images flowed into Chu Fengmian's mind. The amethyst swordsmanship was the most unfamiliar sword technique that Chu Fengmian had ever seen. This scene made Chu Fengmian extremely excited. Chu Fengmian had never seen such a swordsmanship before. It was what Chu Fengmian needed the most. Integrating it into the ancient swordsmanship book was enough to improve the power of the ancient swordsmanship book. Chu Fengmian sat in the library. His consciousness was fully immersed in comprehending the amethyst swordsmanship. Behind Chu Fengmian, sword will soared into the sky. Within the sword will, there was a unique purple sword will. It was the sword will that belonged to the amethyst swordsmanship. When Chu Fengmian entered the library previously, he had killed and comprehended the yin-yang sword code. It had taken him a total of 4 hours. But this time, Chu Fengmian had sat there for a whole day. The amethyst swordsmanship was complicated. It was even more difficult to comprehend than Chu Fengmian had imagined. Above Chu Fengmian's head, purple pages appeared one after another. Dozens of pages had condensed, and they were still condensing. The amethyst swordsmanship was not just a swordsmanship. It also contained the various mysteries of the amethyst stone human tribe. Chu Fengmian had never seen such a divine power of the primordial alien tribe. Now, Chu Fengmian had integrated it into the ancient swordsmanship book. Another 2 hours passed. Suddenly, a shocking sword will burst out from Chu Fengmian's body. The sword will burst out in an instant and disappeared. The sword will on Chu Fengmian's body slowly dissipated. The ancient swordsmanship book above his head also slowly closed. There were more than 80 purple pages in the book. Chu Fengmian did not expect this result. The yin-yang sword code was an immortal emperor sword art. Chu Fengmian had only condensed 20 pages in the ancient swordsmanship book. However, the amethyst swordsmanship had condensed 80 pages in the ancient swordsmanship book. It was 4 times more than the yin-yang sword code. The more pages that were condensed, the greater the improvement the sword technique would bring to the ancient book. Chu Fengmian stood up slowly and put away the amethyst swordsmanship. He could feel that his current strength was much stronger than before. Vaguely, Chu Fengmian even felt that he had reached a bottleneck. With his current strength, he was about to trigger the Deva tribulation. However, this time, Chu Fengmian did not panic. Instead, he showed boundless confidence. With his current strength, he was ready to cross the Deva tribulation. In particular, this was the safest place in the Shang sword sect. It could be said that it was the best opportunity for Chu Fengmian to cross the Deva tribulation in the Shang sword sect. If he crossed the Deva tribulation in the Shang sword sect, Chu Fengmian would not have to worry about being attacked by outsiders. Now that Chu Fengmian was going to cross the Deva tribulation, he was not only worried about the heavenly Tao, but also the obstruction from various experts. At least the 7 major sects would not sit back and watch Chu Fengmian cross the Deva tribulation and enter the celestial realm. End of chapter. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.